Exodite. The ship drifts endlessly through the abyss of space, a relic of ancient ambition and hope, swallowed by the vast, uncaring void. Its reinforced command pod remains eerily silent, encased in layers of radiation shielding. The massive central hull, a monolithic structure of cold steel, lays still, locked in place, its rotation motors long dormant. The ship's long, spindly tail, bearing the aging engines, flickers faintly with residual radiation from the long-dead reactors, perhaps the last breath of its ancient nuclear core, struggling against the entropy of time. As it drifts, it glides past distant stars, their cold light casting faint glimmers upon its weathered hull. It slips through the outskirts of vast nebulae, the swirling clouds of gas and dust washing over it like the slow tides of an eternal sea. Ion storms whisper against its surface, leaving behind faint static charges that dance across its plating before fading into the dark. Nothing more than a silent wanderer, a ghost ship lost to the endless journey between the stars. Its past unwritten, locked in a dance with time itself, waiting, drifting, until the moment destiny calls it to its destination. Aboard the Welsiax, a light year away, Brother Nathaniel held up the glass bottle, tipping it gently. The water cascaded down into the cup, filling it. He passed it to Beornwolf, who placed 2 cups together, pouring the liquid out and spilling some between them. Pushing one to Horrorwolf and taking one for himself, he let the bottle rest, absent-mindedly wiping the water away without a thought. Nathaniel winced at the sight. He had grown up on Medusa, the vast sand crawler his clan called home, ever moving across the dunes. Water was scarce, so scarce that spilling even a few drops on a table was unthinkable. He held his metal cup, absent-mindedly twisting the ring on his augmetic hand, his gaze drifting to the other men. They were rough, their long straw-colored hair braided, while Beorthelm's red hair was tied in a topknot with a seashell woven into it. Barbarians to a man. Growing up on a world covered by the planet-spanning Geofon sea, living on an island perpetually soaked in rain, how could these men have any concept of what it was like to grow up on a world with no water? He wondered, his apothecary mind racing. Had any man in the history of NihtWyrtha ever died of dehydration? Had any of them ever even been truly thirsty? He permitted himself a small smile. In the Imperium of a million worlds, privately run rogue trader outposts, ecclesiarchy-controlled planets, Mechanicus forge worlds, or Astartes homeworlds like his own, no 2 were ever the same, and all had customs that others would consider the height of barbarism. Beornwolf meanwhile looked back at Nathaniel, taking in his black space marine armor, a silver hand etched onto his pauldron. He knew his situation was dire. He was doomed. Possibly, in mere moments, the last defenses would fall. But like all good Wigathane, he would face the end with stoicism, with his wounds to the front. He kept his bright blue eyes locked onto the other man's brown ones. Then he moved the piece precisely 3 spaces. Nathaniel allowed himself another smile as he moved the next regicide piece, collapsing a key bastion in Beornwolf's defense. Beornwolf's head dropped, his expression turning to one of mock sadness. He reached for the obvious piece, but then hovered for a moment. Instead, he grabbed another piece and made a simple move, then sat back with a sheepish grin. Nathaniel's face fell as he studied the regicide board. How could this be? The entire attack had been focused on this side. How had he? Then realization dawned. It had all been a feint. Beornwolf had actually won 10 moves ago. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, then reached into a pouch, took out an armor-piercing round, and tossed it to the other man, who erupted into hysterical laughter. Nathaniel shook his head and began setting the board up once more. "Who's next?" he asked. Hathred, who had been seated nearby, reading a 6-month-old copy of the Omnissiah's Knowledge, looked up. "I'll wager you," he stated. Beornwolf turned to him with an exaggerated bow, Beorthelm laughing along with the others. Nathaniel emptied his glass and stood to make way, still struggling to believe that a simple human could not only beat him, but also draw the game out long enough to make defeat twice as painful. The alarm sounded. All stood, moving for their stations. On the bridge, Captain Siggebield sat confidently on the command throne, feeling the vibrations of the engines through the destroyer's deck. It gave him a sense of power and maneuverability, like an old wooden ship, stressed under the pull of oars and sail as it hunted down a whale. "Auspex?" he asked. Edric stood over the displays, a tendril of cords linking his head to a central socket. With both eyes, he read the data as it uploaded into his brain. It was as if he floated outside the ship, looking in all directions, his mind linked to the servo-skull whiskers that sped ahead of the vessel, its eyes and ears now a part of his own body. He scanned through the metal and glass lenses, his blue eyes seeing as if they were physically there. "Object still at maximum range," he stated. "No change in speed, no signals. If it weren't for the report from Castell, I'd say it was an intersystem asteroid." Sigibild felt the short hairs on his neck bristle under his fingers. Castell was the closest world to NihtWyrtha, some 4 light-years away, though every few centuries the distance increased to 5. 3 months ago, an object had shot through the Forge World system, approaching from the sunward side before using the star's gravity to slingshot out of the Castell system. Their local Navis Astra had been uninterested in chasing it down, deeming it no threat, but they noted its trajectory. Aided by acceleration, it was now headed for the NihtWyrtha system. Magos Ductora Cogitatis. Tiberius had been dogged by a visiting techno-archaeologist, himself inspecting the Great Forge. To placate the old archaeologist, Tiberius had brought out the Questor Revelation to investigate. Rules dictated that all capital ships required an escort, presumably to act as target practice while the more expensive vessel escaped. So the destroyer Welsiex was now powering alongside the much larger Mechanicus heavy cruiser. On the distant hololith, the object was nothing more than a smudge of data. They were so far from NihtWyrtha that the star itself was barely larger than the others in the void, nearly a light-year from home. It hardly seemed worth the trouble. But the object was heading for the planet, or at least the star, and it made sense to investigate now. Just in case it held a swarm of 1 billion Xenos monsters, a sleeping god, or some other cosmic horror. This was the Reach, after all. Stranger things had happened. In the 35th millennium, the very idea of something being far-fetched was laughable. Edric spoke again, breaking Sigibald's reverie. "It's metal," he stated. "Long-range scans detect low levels of gases, mainly oxygen, traces of radiation." He looked sharply at the captain. "If these readings are correct, it's the residual footprint of an atomic reactor. It's a ship." Fear looked up from her navigation console. "Who still uses atomics?" Sigibild squinted at the dot in the center of the absidal windows. "Some backward Xenos race," he suggested. Garspec turned from his station. "Questor Revelation on Vox." Moments later, Ductora Cogitatis Tiberius's voice came through, sounding bored. "Long-range scans make it out to be a void ship of some kind. Its warp engines must be down, so it's piloting in under momentum, would be my guess." Sigibild touched the hilt of Tempest's bite. That didn't sit right. Why not stop at Castell? They had a small dockyard, big enough for an engine or Geller field repair. Why not send out a distress beacon? Then again, had it not been for Castell's report, they wouldn't have been looking for it. A good way to slip into a system unnoticed was to jump in far away and come in under power. Warp translations were nothing if not loud and spectacular. An ambush by stealth would require exactly this kind of maneuver. It's what he would do anyway. "Load torpedoes and clear macro cannons for firing. Alert status." The others glanced at him, then back to their stations as the alarm sounded. Aboard Eldari warship. Echo of Endeavor, Shadowseer Lirashir adjusted his chameleonic cloak, shifting it over his shoulder as he turned his hooded face towards the 2 commanders. His mask, a checkerboard of white and red cloth, concealed any true expression beneath its theatrical pattern. "Intriguing, and all too fanciful," he mused, leveling his staff with a dramatic bow. Farseer Yananai's golden-plated eyes fixed on the Harlequin with measured scrutiny. "I still fail to see the importance of this. I thank you for your news, but as you can see," she extended a long, delicate hand toward the glass wall before them. Beyond it, the ancient starship drifted silently through the void, its hull pitted and scarred by eons in space. "It is hardly a threat. My only concern is the safety of Anaris Elther." Turning away dismissively, her long green cloak billowed in the ethereal winds of the chamber. "The Drukhari rule the Arcana Inclusium. Did you know Kabbalite machinist Valith has gone to Elf Scathia? He serves the Void Reaver now, with that spawn Eilith at his side." Her voice sharpened, her frustration evident as she strode toward the wall of memories, gripping the bone-grown spirit gems set into its surface. Ranger Captain Elandros exhaled softly. She was always this way. Whenever Eilith entered her thoughts, she lost her composure, an unsettling trait for a psyker of her caliber. The last time she had lost control, she had shattered the garden atrium. It had taken a week to scrape up the last remnants of the livestock. Stepping forward, he placed a calming hand on her arm. Lirashir brought this news to us in respect. It is not his fault Elfscathia grows. Inanai stilled, composing herself, then adjusted her mask and turned back to the Harlequin. Lirashir, still in the same deep bow as when she had raged, had not moved a muscle, a living statue in reverence or mockery. Then, as if her acknowledgement had flipped a switch, he straightened in an instant, rising to his full height in one fluid motion. "My scouts brought word of this trifling matter. I merely thought you would be interested," he said, voice lilting with mischief. "After all, despite your remonstrations about the gilded towers of Elfscathia, there is another growing power in the Arcana Inclusium, one that is not Drakari, and this boon, unbidden by desperation but granted by fate, has arrived at a most opportune moment." Yunanay's gaze narrowed. "What power? The Olgarith?" she scoffed. "Those sap-filled logs could hardly threaten a dwarf." Elandros, however, understood. He knew what the Shadowseer was referring to. "NihtWyrtha," he said simply. With an elegant pirouette, Lirashir flourished a small object from the folds of his cloak, a silver warg's head, a piece taken from the command throne of a novice Astra-Wigathane warship. Yunane waved a dismissive hand. "Humans, backward barbarians, there is no threat from them. Besides, my spies tell me their imperial overlords are leaving the Reach. They'll be defenseless." Lirashir ran a gloved hand over the warg's head, and it vanished. In the same instant, he leapt forward, reaching toward Yunanai with such speed that even her honed reflexes could not react in time. From beside her ear, he produced the same warg head, but this time its jaws were open, snarling. The figures were a pair, one watchful, one on the attack. A parlor trick, however she pondered what the jester was implying with it. His masked face hovered inches from hers, his breath just audible beneath the patterned fabric. "But they are seerkin," he whispered, his voice now solemn. "And one drop of blood mistakenly added would make them shades of a waking nightmare." Yunane held his gaze, sensing his meaning in a way that words could not fully convey. Lirashir's voice dropped even lower. "And our troops Farseer has seen farther." For the first time she hesitated. Had she been too preoccupied with Elfscathia, too fixated on the past while another force took shape in the shadows? She glanced at Ranger Captain Elandros. "Can we burn the water globe?" she asked calmly. Elandros bowed his head, considering. "At this moment, if I gather all of Anaris Elthir's forces, I could wipe them out in 2 days." A pause. "Give it a year, a week, give it a decade," he said, his voice steady as he met their eyes. Another pause. No. His own intelligence was not far from the Harlequins. The humans were building defenses, and fast. Lirashir flipped backward with perfect grace, retrieving his staff as he landed. He bowed again, a wry smirk hidden beneath his mask. "And now the new player arrives, leaving one opportunity gone," he mused cryptically. At that moment, the chamber doors parted. A tall figure entered, bowing before them. "Archon," Yunanai acknowledged. 2 Monkay ships entered scanner range. Yunane pondered yet another cryptic foretelling from the jester. "Bring us into the dust cloud. Initiate Camellia Line. We shall see what they do," she ordered. Then, turning toward Elandros, she pointed at the Harlequin. "Find out what this—" she gestured toward Lirashir with mild irritation— "is talking about." Elandros bowed low. Lirashir immediately mimicked his motion with uncanny precision, an exaggerated mirror of the Ranger Captain's solemnity. Yunane shook her head and turned back toward the viewport, feeling the ship shift beneath her feet as it powered toward the asteroid field's veil. Aboard, the bridge of the Quester Revelation. The bridge of the Mechanicus explorator ship was strikingly strange to Beornwulf. He had grown used to Navis Astra-Wigathane ships, where the wide layout of the bridge always made him feel as if he were standing atop a high tower, overseeing everything from a commanding position. By contrast, the Mechanicus cruiser's bridge felt more like being in a basement. The room was cramped, wires hung from the ceiling in tangled loops, Gantries and walkways crisscrossed above, and stairways led to open air for no apparent reason. Every crewman was hunched over in their own sunken cubicle, muttering in quiet concentration, while any remaining space was filled with servitors droning ceaselessly in monotonous litanies, repeating reports to no one's ears again and again. It was madness. Magos Doctora Cogitatus Tiberius was seated upon his command throne, 3 adepts flanking him on either side. Panels, screens, and hololiths hovered in the air, held aloft by metal pincers or servo-cherubs. Captain Sigibild stood at attention before Tiberius, Beornwulf at his left, and Heorwulf at his right. Tiberius's throne whined as hydraulics lifted him higher, bringing him face to face with them. "As you can see, the craft is 2 miles long and of Terran design," he stated. Sigibild studied the vessel as they drew closer. The hololith displayed its shape across dozens of fragmented screens, forming an ill-fitting collage of data. "I don't recognize the design," he admitted. Beornwulf examined it as well. A bulbous head, possibly a sensor array covered in plating. A stem-like neck leading to an unremarkable main hull, with another thin connection leading to the engines. It did remind him of something. It was not his place to speak, but he did so anyway. "Karabath," he stated. The others turned to look at him. "You're not a shipwright, are you?" Engineer Auspex adept Carson Volks dismissed him with a glance. Beornwulf had never liked being talked down to, nor did he have patience for ignorance. "Depends if you've ever boarded one," he replied. Tiberius watched the 2 men spar without comment. One of the 3 wargs sprawled among the gantries opened an eye, its snout rising to bear a large fang as it growled. Beornwulf ignored it, addressing the engineer Auspex adept. He tried to explain his reasoning. "Scale it down, remove the radiation plating, command in the bow, midsection storage baffles aft. Karabath ships are the same, bridge at the front, unlike Imperial craft, midsection, and engines separated by gantries. It's to stop radiation exposure," he said. He was proud of himself. He had learned it all from Edric, who talked incessantly about void ships. Sigibild glanced at him, then turned to Tiberius. "The sergeant-at-arms is correct, Lord. I believe Archmagos Pyrovox used an ancient design for the Karabaths." Carson Volks was about to rebuke the captain when a jolly voice echoed across the bustling deck. "Oh, quite. The barbarian is well read." They turned as the techno-archaeologist shuffled onto the bridge, followed by 3 servitors carrying scrolls. "The Karabath is based on an old design. They were built to transport machinery in humanity's early colonial days," the old man continued. "And that ship," he pointed a bony finger at the hololith, "is of the same concept, if not the exact design." He stopped before the screens and giggled to himself, rifling through a scroll from one of the servitors before tossing it aside and grabbing another. "Ah," techno-archaeologist Vane Kelev declared, unrolling it. He turned it to show them the schematics. It matched the vessel beyond the iron hull. An old sleeper ship, pre-warp tech. In the early colonial days, long before the Dark Age or even the Commonwealth, proto-Karabaths were sent ahead to deliver the machinery needed for colonization. The settlers followed later in sleeper ships. He pointed to the display. "And here one is," Kelev shrugged. 20,000 years late, but at least it arrived, eh?" Tiberius blinked, speechless. His hands trembled. "Carrying fully intact STC," he asked, his mind racing. If this were true, a ship untouched for millennia from before the Dark Age, it could contain more technology than the entire Imperium possessed. He would be revered across the Mechanicum. Then reality struck him. Damia Veratrix would be revered. He would be remembered, perhaps. But all the same, the thought burned in his mind. The old man laughed. Oh no, sleeper ships had no standard template constructors aboard. The Proto-Karabaths brought those. "This ship has colonists," he mused. "Perhaps some simple STC components for ship repair, but nothing extraordinary." Sigibild's hand tightened on the hilt of Tempest Bite. "We detect no signs of technology," Carson Volks said firmly. "All the same, Engineer Auspex adept," said Tiberius. "We cannot discount the presence of a dormant AI, even an Iron Man." Beornwulf and Heorwulf exchanged glances. This was the stuff of nightmares. The cybernetic war. The stories haunted every voidsman's dreams. Carson Volks gave a whistling snort. "The concept is preposterous," he said indignantly. The techno-archaeologist chuckled. Oh no, the ships had human crews who took turns sleeping in shifts according to records. At least 19 sleeper ships have been found since the heresy. Not one had an AI aboard. Siegbield had never heard of this. Crew alive? He asked. He knew of cryosleep, but after 20,000 years? It seemed impossible. The old man outright laughed this time. Oh, don't be silly, young fellow. There were all corpse ships, but you never know what still drifts out there from the great days of humanity before the Dark Ages. The tension in the room seemed to dissolve. A servitor's voice cut through the murmurs. Ship within visual range. They turned their eyes to the viewport. The hull was clearer now, scarred and pitted with age, some sections breached by impacts the size of a Lehman Russ. It looked ancient. Vane Kelev made a strange noise as he squinted closer through an eyeglass at the screen. Strange, he muttered. Tiberius's throne hissed as it moved closer. Define strange. The old man pointed to the nameplate etched across the hull. Most of these old relics have script in High Gothic, some in Low Gothic even, but I can't seem to place the language. Hjorwulf glanced at Beornwulf, then back at the screen. They could read it clearly. Beornwulf cleared his throat. He was probably going to be executed anyway. Langfarawita, he said. The old man turned to look at him. Written in Wirthan. So this is a ship from the same people who built the Geofon break? Beornwulf grinned. Looks that way, Lord, my people. He pointed to the viewport. It's written in Wirthan, but the script is stylized, using a more runic base. We don't use it these days, but for festival announcements. Hjorwulf, ever helpful, added, Langfarawita, Lord. Roughly translated to Gothic, it means fate of the long traveler in our mother tongue. Tiberius sat back in his throne, his gaze shifting from the screens to the techno-archaeologist, then to the deputation from the Walsiaks. Very well. Sigibild, take a Voidsman party aboard. You will accompany the techno-archaeologist, he said, leaning forward and raising a golden-plated finger. Take no risks, and in the Omnissiah's name, don't switch anything on. Just assess what's aboard and return. If it's safe, we'll tow the ship back to Fiskbala. Sigibild bowed, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword as he did. As they turned, he whispered, What have you gotten us into? Before Beornwulf could reply, the old techno-archaeologist shuffled over, his eyes glinting with excitement. Oh, what fun we are going to have. Aboard the Navis Astra Wigathane shuttlecraft Spioglass, Lieutenant Osbjorn touched the controls gently. The shuttle slipped slightly too close, and a scraping sound shuddered through the craft. The passengers looked at each other as Halfoxton quickly pulled the emergency lateral thruster. The scraping stopped, and the shuttle drifted through the shuttle bay doors once again. Osbjorn winced but said nothing. Sigibild, calm and composed, looked at the pilot. I assume you qualified in the NVS-9? He asked, his tone completely neutral. No, Captain, Osbjorn admitted. The 10, not the 9, but it's almost the same. Edric, manning the Auspex console, added dryly, Yes, same engines but 2 feet wider. Beornwulf and Hjorwulf exchanged glances. Without a word, both closed their breathers and switched to internal oxygen, tightening their straps. Brother Nathaniel, observing the Wigathine's silent reaction, repressed a smirk, then casually kicked Hethrid, who had started snoring. Nathaniel didn't immediately reach for his helmet, which was still in the locker above his head. If the ship was suddenly voided to space, his post-human physiology would give him a few minutes to save everyone aboard and retrieve his helmet later. The techno-archaeologist, seemingly oblivious to the entire exchange, chuckled in joy. He had not noticed anything. The shuttle passed through the bay doors and moved gently into the docking arms of the ancient craft. Outside, in the cold vacuum of space, Bjorthelm and his void armsmen clung to the Langfarawita's ancient hull. They had located the shuttle bay, its entrance sealed by a thin layer of radiation-shielded tin. The bay door motors had long since failed, but, as in the Karabath-class ships, there was an external access point. The runners had been well made, and with slow, methodical effort, the Voidsmen began winding the manual wheels, forcing the massive bay doors open. Inside, all the shuttle bays were full, except for one. It was here that Lieutenant Osbjorn carefully brought the Welsiak's shuttle to rest. The Spioglass was smaller than the bay had been built to take, the other shuttles looming massive in the darkness. These were clearly heavy-duty transports, designed to take awakened passengers en masse to a planet's surface. Osbjorn listened to the dull monotone of the servitor monitoring the hatch seal. The connection engaged with a heavy clunk. The seal type was unknown to the crew, but the Welsiak shuttle was equipped to form a vacuum lock even against open-hull breaches. Within seconds, a secure airlock was formed. With a final hiss, the lock sealed. Osbjorn exhaled sharply, letting out a sigh of relief. Siggebield rose, his boots clunking as they mag-locked to the deck. "Once we are aboard, push off and wait outside the hull," he ordered. "We may have to void jump in an emergency." He leaned in slightly. "And don't try any clever maneuvers." Beyond the spougglass, Bjorthelm and his team floated past, making for a hatch along the derelict ship's docking gantry. Bjornwolf glanced through the viewport and raised a salute. Bjorthelm returned the gesture before leading the boarding crew toward the ancient hatch. Aboard the Langfarawita aft section, Ranger Captain Elandros stepped lightly across the dust-covered deck, his grav belt keeping him stable as if he were walking on an Aris Elthir. The lumens on his void helm cast beams across consoles, pods, and the stark, angular architecture of the alien vessel. Strange writing adorned the walls, some in faded red, others in dull green. He couldn't decipher the script, but he guessed they were warnings or directional markers. The machinery around him was archaic, boxy, rigid, devoid of elegance. No smooth curves, only harsh, unforgiving angles. Each corner was covered in a foam-like material, possibly to prevent impacts in zero gravity. But if that were the case, why not integrate the machines into the walls? Why leave these bulky obstructions exposed, as if the engineers expected to bump into them constantly? He brushed dust from a glass panel, peering inside. The misty grime barely obscured a row of brightly colored cylinders. Each one bore pictograms of fruit, clusters of berries, dripping with moisture, drawn in almost reverent detail. He turned to the panel beside the glass. The same pictograms were carved into the hardened metal. Elandros scowled. How had a species that wrote in pictograms built a ship this size? How had they propelled it across the stars to the galaxy's edge? It was insanity. From above, a figure dropped soundlessly from the ceiling. Shadowseer Lirashir landed beside him, offered a curt bow to the assembled rangers, then turned stiffly, like a marionette, toward the console. The Harlequin's masked face tilted as he examined the glass panel. Without a word, he produced a small, glowing stone and pressed it against the metal surface. It stuck effortlessly, held by some unseen force. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he raised a delicate hand and pressed one of the buttons. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then came a faint whirring, a mechanical click, and a distant rattle of unseen mechanisms. One of the cylinders rolled forward inside the case, then dropped through a small hatch. The Rangers moved like lightning, weapons rising in unison, barrels leveled at the mysterious contraption. Elandros drew his sword, stepping back. Was this a war engine? Had the Harlequin just activated some kind of alien dreadnought? What madness was this? Lirashir, unbothered by the sudden alarm, caught the cylinder midair as it drifted. Turning like an automaton, he presented the object to Elandros, bowing low, arms extended like a supplicant at a temple service. Elandros took it carefully. It was metal, cylindrical, smooth to the touch. One end had a loop, a pin. Was it a weapon? A grenade? The pictogram on its side showed berries hanging from a tree, droplets of water glistening in sunlight. The artwork was fine, almost beautiful. He turned it in his hands. Lirashir straightened to his full height. "I would not open it now," he said lightly. "It is frozen, but when it thaws, it will be a beverage fit for an Archon." Elandros frowned. A drink? These aliens stored fruit in metal cylinders? A ship this size, with enough space for entire biospheres, and they resorted to sealing fruit in tubes? He shook his head. Barbaric. Looking around, he finally understood what this space was. Tables, screens, rows of similar machines, all silent. This was some kind of eating hall. He turned sharply at Lirashir's sudden movement. The Shadowseer spun into a pirouette, his staff whirling into his hands as he pointed it toward the far end of the chamber. "The fool enters stage right," he declared, "and brings a jester." Elandros followed his gaze toward the darkened hall, leading to a sealed bulkhead. His comms came alive. "Ranger Captain, a human ship just made docking." Elandros stiffened. Lirashir made an exaggerated bow, arms outstretched in mock reverence. Elandros ignored him and tapped his comm. Were you seen? Negative, Captain. We're using the superstructure as cover, and the Camellia line is active. Elandros exhaled slowly. So far, so good. Maintain position, report if anything changes. Then, to his rangers, we must find the crew before the Monkey do. Ideas? Lirashir was suddenly standing upside down on the ceiling, arms crossed as if asleep. Then, with the grace of a skipping stone, he flitted across the gravity-less chamber, moving toward the far hatch. Elandros sighed. He motioned to his men. Follow him. Aboard the Langfarawita forward section, the outer hatch from the shuttle was primitive, almost orc-like in its simplicity. A basic wheel mechanism. No locks, no servitor-guarded weapons, no explosive failsafes, just a wheel. The hatch swung outward, another stupid design flaw. Outer hatches should be inward sealing. Pressure came from within, not outside. How had humanity survived long enough to spread across the stars with such unevolved minds? Hathred stepped through first, waiting as the others followed. He paused at the hatch, hesitating. Should he make an incantation of locking? No, maybe not. A wheel had no machine spirit. Still, out of paranoia, he muttered a blessing anyway. When he turned, he found Beornwolf staring at him through his visor. Seriously? He asked flatly. Do you bless wooden doors? Hathred shrugged. The Omnissiah is in all things. Beornwolf smiled and was just moving through the hatch when he noticed a mark. It looked just like the Eldari glyph on Hollow Crown's station. There it had been left by a Harlequin scout who had presumably aided the prisoner's escape. Or so they had guessed. But here, the ship was abandoned, had been for millennia? Could this be an origin of Wirthan runes? Could there be a link between the two cultures, way back in history? He looked closer. It looked not as old as the other markings, but still looked dusty with age. He made a note to ask the old technoarchaeologist about it later. The boarding team reached the main interior hatch. At least they had understood airlocks back then. The Void team was waiting, without a tech adept. Hathred placed a gauntleted hand on the door. It was complex. He wasn't a tech marine, just an adept, but his fingers traced the metal, searching. A recess. A hidden panel flipped open. Inside, a number pad with 9 digits, and beside it, a heavy-duty lever. He mused. What's wrong? Captain Sigabild asked. 25 men waited, all silent, watching, all impatient, except Beornwolf and Heorwolf, who had started playing Throne and Heresy in the dust, scratching the board into the wall with gloved fingertips. Hathred noted that Beornwolf had the upper hand. One more cross, and he would win. He shook his head and turned back to the door. Captain, I believe that if this system were powered, a 9-digit security code would be required to unlock the release lever. The technoarchaeologist brightened, nodding with authority. Ah, yes, quite common in ancient void ships. You see, as there is no servitor skull for retinal scans, this system must have required a manually inputted code. There may have been an incantation as well, though regrettably, no records have survived from that era to indicate what it may have been. Of course, such devices required the motive force of the machine spirit. Siggebield had no interest in a lecture, no power, no open door. He glanced at the only Astartes in a light year. Lord, I believe an angelic intervention is in order. Hathred looked offended. Captain, respect to Brother Nathaniel, but he is an apothecary, not a tech marine. Nathaniel understood the meaning immediately. I don't believe the captain meant an adept, little brother. With effortless strength, he grasped the lever and forced it down. The ancient locks shattered, rusted metal snapping like paper string. The hatch parted slightly. A rush of dust and gas hissed outward. Edric checked his auspex. Atmosphere detected. Nathaniel studied his display. Low oxygen, breathable, but not for long. Beorthelm, the Void Armsman captain, stepped forward. Nobody removes their helmet. Stay on internal oxygen. Relic ships are dangerous. Nathaniel agreed. Ancient vessels could carry pathogens humanity has not encountered in millennia. Best follow Beorthelm's advice. The team moved forward. Stepping into the past, Siggebield took the lead. Beornwolf pushed ahead, taking his flank. Heorwolf mirrored him on the other side. It was the duty of a Wigathane to protect their captain. For Heorwolf, it was honor. For Beornwolf, it was the sheer amount of paperwork required if the captain died. Both were equally determined to prevent it. Beyond the doors, they stepped into a row of towering shapes, dreadnoughts. massive, hulking war engines. No visible weapons, only brutal power claws for arms. Nathaniel stared, awe in his voice. Contemptor class. These things are ancient. The techno-archaeologist nearly tripped over himself in excitement. Yes, indeed, he gasped, rushing forward to examine them. You know, there's an STC on Grimness for this very design. Bjorthel moved around the back of the machines, frowning. That's not normal. Several of the team followed. They stopped short. The backs of the dreadnoughts were open. Inside, there were seats, no sarcophagus. The techno-archaeologist looked up sharply. Most unusual, he murmured. In fact, the connections here are just like those on NihtWyrtha, the ones that allow Wigathene to interface with Cataphractia armor. Sigibild froze, his expression shifting. His people, they used the same augmentations, the same interface systems. His mind raced. He turned, scanning the chamber. Stairs led upward. Another hatch to the rear. The bridge would be above. He posted guards, then ascended the stairs, Beornwulf and Heorwulf taking point. At the top, they paused beside an open hatch. Inside was a Cartographia Stellarum. They stepped into a room of madness. Rails crisscrossed the chamber, thousands of rings attached. Each ring bore a name or a numerical sequence attached to moving mechanisms. A machine designed to track the stars, yet built with an insane complexity, as if the galaxy itself had been constructed within a single room. The walls were adorned with charts and long sequences of numbers, some so ancient they had crumbled to dust. The techno-archaeologist clapped his hands in delight. Astonishing, he gasped. If only we had motive force, we could see it work. Hethred worked his way along the side of the vast machine, his fingers tracing the dust-covered metal. The device was immense, its intricacies beyond comprehension. Then, his hand found something, a recessed panel, not unlike the manual override mechanisms found on the ship's ancient hatches. He exhaled. There's a manual override, he said, voice steady. Gripping a long, rusted rod, he braced himself and pushed. The lever resisted at first, unmoved by mere mortal effort. Then, with a deep grinding groan, the ancient machinery shuddered. A fine mist of centuries-old dust erupted into the air, swirling in the dim lumens of their armor lamps. The sound of shifting gears, long dormant, echoed through the chamber. The floor beneath them vibrated ever so slightly as the rings of the machine began to turn, slow at first, then with eerie precision. Thousands of spheres, globes, and metallic orbs moved in intricate, interwoven patterns. Their paths seemed chaotic at first, but soon a pattern emerged. Sigibild's breath caught. He recognized this shape, the void-drawn lines of a four-dimensional map shifting before him, revealing a portrait of the galaxy long before the Imperium had cast its shadow over the stars. The eastern segmentum, he whispered. His gaze traveled across the forming constellations. Segmentum Ultima. His gloved hand hovered over one glowing sphere, golden and bright amid the cosmic darkness. Terra. Calth, Prandium, Tarsus Ultra, he murmured, calling out the names as they appeared in succession. Nathaniel took a step forward, following his own path along the vast machine. Ikar 4, he said, then hesitated. His brow furrowed. He looked again. The Maelstrom Zone, it's not here, he muttered. He moved around the machine, scanning its shifting cosmos. His finger hovered over another missing mark on the star map. And here, Sphera Obscura. The techno-archaeologist's lenses clicked and refocused as his servo skulls flitted over the machine, recording every detail. He tilted his head as he processed the new information, his mind racing. No, he muttered, voice thick with excitement. Sphera Obscura, at the time this map was made, was the world of Halicarnassus Prime, one of Terra's earliest colonies. According to Mechanicus records, its star collapsed into a supermassive black hole some 20,000 years ago. He turned to Nathaniel. That at least gives us a time frame for this map's creation. As for the Maelstrom, he shook his head. No one knows precisely when it formed. But from this, he gestured to the silent void where the warp storm now raged. It clearly did not exist when this device was built. Sigibild's eyes traced a cluster of smaller, faintly glowing blue orbs, tiny by comparison to the vast segmentum. His breath was heavy with reverence. The null stars, they predate the Maelstrom. He let his hand hover over them for a moment before shifting his focus to the void where the Maelstrom should have been. This is where it should be, he murmured, his voice edged with sorrow. Slowly, he reached out, tracing the thousands of tiny worlds scattered across the empty space. "Look at them," he said quietly. "All the worlds that once lived here, all lost to the warp," he exhaled, "simply forgotten." The air was thick with something none of them could name, a sense of loss, of history stripped away by time and catastrophe. Beornwulf, who had little love for the star charts of navigators, found himself drawn to a different section of the vast device. Beyond the null stars, beyond the warp-torn regions, a small, insignificant sector appeared, barely inches across compared to the galaxy-spanning display. Yet he knew it instantly. His heart tightened. Leaning closer, he whispered the name as if invoking an ancestor. NihtWyrtha. He traced his gloved finger along the faint, forgotten points of light. Thrie Gilden Steoren, Niwa Lunden, and Steoren Ende. The words left his lips like a prayer to something long dead. The techno-archaeologist turned sharply. "Can read that? My Wirthan is still not good, and these scripts are different from those on the Geofon brick," he asked, voice sharp with curiosity. Beorhthelm spoke before Beornwulf could answer. "It's in Wirthan, but it's in a Wudawara script. They stylize their letters," he said simply. Then, for the benefit of the others, 3 golden stars, New London, Star's End. The techno-archaeologist nodded, murmuring to himself. "Manifold Dawn," he muttered. "That must be the 3 stars, Grimness, and I suppose Incoloris must be Star's End," he sighed. Clearly, the names never stuck. They were either renamed or colonized much later. Nathaniel, who had been following the delicate silver lines crisscrossing the map, froze. His eyes widened. "These," he trailed off, calculating trajectories in his head. Then he turned to Beornwulf, his expression unreadable. "These are the colony ships for your homeworld." Beornwulf did not answer at first. He only stared at the 7 thin lines, trailing across the emptiness like threads of fate stretched between the stars. Nathaniel exhaled. "These are your ancestors." A silence fell. The air felt heavy. The others, warriors, scholars, voidsmen, stared at the map, staggered by the enormity of what they had just uncovered. The techno-archaeologist broke the silence. He frowned, tilting his head slightly. 7 colony sleeper ships, but why did this one never arrive? Or arrive 10,000 years late? Beornwulf's voice was low but firm. Sphera obscura. The techno-archaeologist's eyes lit up in understanding. "Ah, of course." He shuffled closer, his mind racing as he followed the 7 delicate silver threads running across the ancient map. "All 7 ships used Hālgengas Prime as a navigational waypoint," he murmured. He exhaled slowly. The birth of the black hole must have interfered with the last 3's course. A moment of stillness passed. "The souls aboard," he said softly, for once without enthusiasm, "had no idea they would never reach their new home, all because of a collapsing star." He stood straight for the first time, a hint of solemnity in his voice. Sigibild had been running similar calculations in his mind. He nodded slowly. "Well, something for the Mechanicus to solve later. Maybe we can find the other 2 ships, once we know where to look." Beornwulf stood in silent wonder before a towering mural of intertwining serpents listening to the conversation with only half his thoughts. He stepped into one of the alcoves, following the pattern. "Most fascinating," the techno-archaeologist mused, shuffling over, running a gloved hand reverently along the faded etchings. His voice was light, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Imagine being a pioneer in those days, venturing into the unknown, trusting only in your calculations and the mercy of the void." He chuckled softly, eyes tracing the pattern with an almost childlike curiosity. "This appears to be a repository." Beornwulf looked at him. "A librarius?" The techno-archaeologist moved to the shelves lining the alcove, his servo skulls flickering through the dimness, red light scanning the spines of the tomes. "A librarium antiquus," he agreed, excitement seeping into his voice. Beornwulf stepped forward. The alcove was lined with books, old books, made of paper. Running his own fingers across the bindings, feeling the brittle texture of the ancient leather. He squinted at the glyphs, then spoke slowly. All of these are on astrogation, theoretical void phenomena, mathematics, navigation." The techno-archaeologist clapped his hands together in sheer delight, practically skipping to the next shelf. "And these?" he asked breathlessly. Beornwulf scanned the spines again. "Names. Men deeds. These were histories, accounts of their people. How many had survived in some form to this day? How many had been distorted by time, reshaped into myths? He carefully pulled one from the shelf. The spine crumbled instantly. The old man caught his wrist with surprising gentleness, halting him before more damage could be done. "That happens," he said softly. "I should have warned you." He gestured to the servo skulls, which continued scanning the shelves. Nothing beyond a few hundred years is usually intact on ships this old. Even with preservation, organic materials decay. However, we may still be able to reconstruct some of the text. It takes time, of course, and an army of scribes. The very idea of it seemed to delight him. At the far end of the alcove, faded and cracked, was a map, pinned to a small reading lectern. Horrorwolf's lumen traced its surface, and his heart pounded in recognition. An island, surrounded by a sea. At a glance, it resembled his home, but something was off. It was divided into 7 parts, and within one of them, the name Langfarawita was inscribed, and the island was the wrong shape. He wondered, was this the region on Terra the colony ship's crew came from? Each region designated a ship. His gaze drifted outward. The sea around the island wasn't just water. It was meant to be space. There were orbital platforms and a moon, the writing too faded to see. He saw another parchment, laying under the map. He brushed the dust edging up the paper. Hjorwolf's breath hitched. Beside him, the techno-archaeologist made a sound between awe and horror as he read what was there. Hjorwolf realized, instinctively, utterly, that they had just uncovered something beyond value. Something the Imperium would kill every living being in the entire reach to silence. The old man looked at the others still discussing astrometric theories. He placed a fold of his robe over the lectern. With care he moved away, the map and parchment gone, revealing bare wood that had lain covered for millennia, clean and bright. He glanced at Hjorwolf, and both men moved back to the other's side. Sigabild pushed off the rail surrounding the vast device, his expression grim but resolute. "We have a huge amount of information here. Best leave it until we can get all of this back to NihtWyrtha. For now, let's see if we can find the crew." Bjornwolf nodded. He turned toward the next chamber, his voice flat, humorless. "We might even find a few distant relatives." He caught Hjorwolf's visor. His expression was one of concern. He ignored it. It would keep until later. Heathred stopped turning the great handle and caught his breath, resting one hand on the tip of the device. He looked over it, now still. The lumen of his companions disappearing into the other room, he nodded and patted the machine with his hand. "Well done." He told it. For 20,000 years it had lain here. Now it had performed its task once more. He turned, following the others. Aboard the Navis Astra Wigathane shuttlecraft Spowglass. Edric sat at the auspex station of the shuttle, his fingers moving over the controls as he ran through numbers and trajectories. Far off, so far that it seemed unreal, the Quester Revelation hung motionless in the void, a massive shadow against the starfield. But in truth, it was moving at the same speed as Langfarawita, drifting through space in perfect synchrony. Alongside the Mechanicus warship, the Welsiak stood guard, a lean, predatory silhouette beside the larger vessel, like a thin scroll drifting in the wake of a towering tome. Edric tore his gaze away and refocused on his calculations. He was working through the Langfarawita's velocity, the time it had taken to reach this point from Castell, and the complex alignment of orbiting bodies and gravitational anomalies within the Arcana Inclusium along its path. Everything checked out. The trajectory from Castell had been correct. If all went well, once the relic was docked on Fiskbala, he could examine its cogitator banks and trace its entire journey, perhaps even confirm if it had truly come from Terra. Then he frowned. Something was wrong. He had been working out how long it would take the relic to reach NihtWyrtha if left adrift. The numbers didn't make sense. By his calculations, the ship would now miss the planet by a greater distance than Furberg. That wasn't right. When they had first spotted the Langfarawita, it had been on a perfect trajectory for NihtWyrtha. His earlier calculations had been rough, but he was certain they had not been that wrong. He checked his numbers again, adjusted for gravitational influence, ran them once more. Still wrong. Opening the Vox, he activated the external channel. "Questa Revelation, Omnissiah's blessings be upon you." This is Shuttle Navicula Imperatoria requesting a warp translation calculation for the Langfarawita's real space mass. From the pilot's seat, Osbjorn glanced at him, bored. What gives? He asked. Edric rubbed at the augmetic, replacing his left eye. I was calculating travel time. If we don't take the relic in tow, my numbers are off. Osbjorn shrugged. Maybe your calculations are wrong. From the co-pilot's station, Hālgengas spoke without looking up. I'm sure the navigator knows how to navigate better than you, Osbjorn scoffed. You're not even a navigator. You're an armsman, Hālgengas smirked. Weapon seer, second class, he corrected. I only do void work because Bjorthelm occasionally needs a hand. Osbjorn nodded as if remembering something. Oh yeah, you two are from the same town, aren't you? The one where they make that ale? Hālgengas shook his head. Bjorthelm hails from Gifford's Hold. My family is from Denutun. He allowed himself a slight smirk. And yes, we make NihtWyrtha ale, Osbjorn grinned. Good ale. A pause. Not as good as Wudawara mead, he added. Edric sat back in his chair, resting his head in one hand. He was seriously contemplating how he could explain why both of them had suffered a tragic accident outside the shuttle. The Vox crackled to life. A voice heavy with irritation filled the cabin. Megos ductora cogitatus Tiberius. I would ask why you are wasting my cogitators, but I can see why. Langfarawita has gained mass. Tiberius paused. Do you have any explanation? Edric sat up straight. He rubbed his augmetic eye again, thinking. Not at this time, he admitted. I will get back to you, Omnissiah's blessings. He cut the feed. Osbjorn and Hālgengas exchanged glances before both turned toward the viewport. Edric followed their gaze. Langfarawita still hung motionless in the void. Or at least, it appeared to. But the numbers didn't lie. Osbjorn cleared his throat. What could have changed the mass of the ship? Edric exhaled slowly, his fingers absently running over the edges of his auspex controls. Something added to it, he said at last. His augmetic eye whirred slightly as he stared at the drifting relic. Something the size of a small void ship. Aboard the Langfarawita forward section, the passage to the bridge was illuminated by the shifting, uncertain glow of their lumens, shadows dancing and flickering against the ancient metal walls. Sigurd moved forward, each step measured, his instincts telling him that the command center lay ahead. The corridor widened abruptly, giving way to a vaulted hall, cathedral-like in its vastness but devoid of the familiar skull iconography that marked imperial craftsmanship. Instead, serpentine patterns wove along the towering pillars, coiling upward in endless motion, their forms carved into the walls with an unsettling fluidity. There was something old here, not heretical, not Xenos, but something forgotten, something of mankind's earliest days among the stars. Flanking the hall, archways yawned into darkness, leading into recessed chambers, apse-like alcoves, though their purpose was unclear. Sigurd traced his lumen across one, stepping into its shadowed embrace. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing the silent ring of cryopods at its heart, each one arranged in a deliberate circle around a central mass of tubes, pipes, and empty cylinders of glass. These must be for the command crew, Sigurd observed, voice echoing slightly in the stillness. Bornwolf stepped forward, running a gloved hand across the thick layer of dust caking one of the pods. He wiped it away, revealing a padded interior, faintly browned with age but otherwise undisturbed. Within, a headrest lay indented, shaped for a human form. A chair, or perhaps a bed. Empty, he said flatly. So is this one, Hjorewolf added, crouching over another, his lumen casting long shadows against the frost-rimmed glass. Sigurd swept his gaze across the room. Clearly, this chamber was meant for those who remained awake, running the ship's systems. His brow furrowed. I wonder what happened to them. Before any of them could speculate further, a voice crackled over the external vox, sharp, urgent. We found the rest of the crew. Sigurd turned sharply, boots grinding against the ancient metal deck as he strode toward the adjacent chamber. The others followed swiftly, lumens bobbing and flickering as they moved. Bjorthelm was already there, kneeling, his posture eerily still, as if in prayer. Before him, laid out in an identical formation to the empty cryopods they had just seen, were the last remnants of the ship's crew. Not empty, not decayed. And in the stillness of that chamber, something cold settled in Sigurd's gut. The light from Nathaniel's shoulder lumen cut through the dusty haze of the chamber, its pale glow reflecting off the glass. The cryopod stood before him like a silent tomb, its reinforced edges still intact despite the ages. The cold mist of its final venting had long since settled, leaving behind a thin layer of frost along the edges of its viewing panel. He stepped closer, his heavy boots making no sound on the deck. The others stood back, waiting. Even the techno-archaeologist had gone still, his earlier excitement subdued by the sheer weight of time pressing down upon them. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, adjusting his eye lens's magnification as he peered through the frost-covered panel. Inside, the body remained, perfectly still, untouched by the passage of millennia. The frost upon the glass had not spread to the figure within. A faint glimmer of preserved moisture clung to the skin, preventing the slow decay of flesh. Yet the man, if he could still be called such, was unmistakably dead. His face was calm, unnervingly so, as if he had passed in sleep rather than in agony. His lips were slightly parted, his expression frozen not in horror nor pain, but in an eerie state of tranquility. The deathly pallor of his skin should have been the only clue to his passing, yet something deeper, something unnatural, kept him preserved beyond reason. Nathaniel's gaze traced the veins along the man's temple, noting the faint discoloration. His augmetic fingers tapped the frost-crusted readout beside the pod. The medical display was long dead, yet the body told him everything he needed to know. The Susan membrane had activated. His own heart beat slower at the realization. He had seen this before, the meditative coma that Astartes fell into when grievously wounded, a desperate final effort by their biology to preserve them for as long as possible. It had taken hold here, in a human who had never known the gene-forged gifts of the Emperor. Unquamslop. That was the NihtWyrthan term for it, the sleep of the unquiet, a state where the body refused to die, even as the soul passed beyond. A hand moved to his belt pouch instinctively, fingers brushing against a small vial of stims and revivicators. A reflex, an instinct, because everything in his training told him this body was still alive, useless. The man was long past saving, but the mere presence of that thought disturbed him. The extremities were blue with cold, yet not frostbitten. The eyes, half-lidded beneath a thin veil of ice, still gleamed faintly as if staring just beyond the glass, as if waiting. He considered out loud. Chemicals like glycerol or DMSO were used to prevent ice crystal formation, which can destroy cells during freezing. I see no frosting. Nathaniel tapped a finger against the glass. The sound barely carried, a dull, muffled knock against the stillness of the chamber. He had seen the dead before. He had watched battle brothers breathe their last. He had gazed upon the desiccated remains of warriors long fallen, reduced to bones and rags. This was something altogether different. I can only assume that when in the Unquilmslop that you people experience, the body's cells must stop all metabolic processes. This includes halting enzymatic breakdown and bacterial activity. Doubtless, if we open one up, the body will collapse into dust. Nathaniel said solemnly. Hethred was on his knees looking at the pod's internal workings through an open panel. In these type of pods, the body is cooled to minus 196 degrees or lower, liquid nitrogen range. This halts all cellular activity, including decomposition. I can only assume they were preserved a long time, while the lack of bacteria left us with what we have here, Unquilmslop corpses. Bjornwolf stepped up beside Brother Nathaniel, his expression grim. Happened to me once, when I was small, he said, touching his chest where, beneath the ceramite of his armor, 2 long scars crossed his skin. Unquilmslip, I fought in the Jotunbars. Nathaniel looked down at the human, the memory resurfacing. Yes, it's in your records, he stated. He moved back, checking his auspex. The Imperium knew NihtWyrthans had the Susan membrane added to their genes at some point. Clearly, the original colonists were given it, so it was always meant to be a part of you. Sigibild came up to them and peered at the body of his long-lost ancestor, the glass reflecting his own features. The squats of the southern holds have it too. It appears all the colony sleepers sent to the Reach were all given the gene. He allowed himself a faint, rare smile, though they weren't squats at the time. Nathaniel lowered his auspex. Quite, but it's mainly the worlds in the Arcana Inclusium seem to have it. Well, the ones we have found, other than Castell. Wolf, who had been examining the walls, spoke without looking back. Woundstitcher Grunor told me the beastmen of Draken Delve have Unquilm Slop too. They call it the Death Binding. Bjornwolf turned to glance at his companion. He remembered when he had first met the prince aboard the NihtWyrtha, full of disdain for beastmen. Not long after, he and a beastman had taken down an orc bomba together. Since then, Wolf had even taken to wearing beastman ornamentation and had developed a taste for woodland hunting. Strange how people change. He looked back to the corpse. What did he die of? Other than being 20,000 years old, I mean. The techno-archaeologist, who had been scribbling endlessly on his scrolls, looked up. Perhaps the machine spirit was not placated. Gamma rays could have killed them. It would have sterilized the ship too, explaining the lack of decay, Sigibield observed. The ship passed close to a black hole. It would explain it. Hethrid let out a dry laugh. The machine spirit on this relic is less capable of cogitation than a servitor skull. He tapped the ancient pod with a gauntleted finger. The cogitator banks through that wall don't even have organics left in them. Nathaniel exhaled, shaking himself out of his thoughts. He stopped twisting the ring on his augmetic hand and ran it over one of the pod's display controls, his auspex scanning the ancient equipment. Without an autopsy, I can't say. No sign of violence. The pods are still sealed. These old devices were meant to suspend life. He looked up at the empty glass cylinders and pipes above. If the ship's main power source failed, whether nuclear, fusion, or something else, the cryopods would eventually lose power. Backup batteries might have been designed to last centuries, but after tens of thousands of years they would have run dry. Over time, shielding degrades, and residual radiation could damage power conduits, leading to cascading failures. Hethrid ran his own scanner over the machinery. I'm picking up latent power residue. I don't think it was a power issue. This machine takes little energy to maintain. He reached up and pulled at a cable. The machinery is intact, but it seems to have shut down automatically. Berthelm exhaled sharply. Imagine waking up trapped in a sarcophagus, he said grimly, making the sign of the Aquila. Clawing at the glass, screaming as your air ran out. Bjornwolf took a sharp breath. He had just added another method to his growing list of ways not to die. No, Hethred shook his head. Nothing of the sort. He pointed inside one of the pods. All pods have that handle there. Inside, just as he had said, a sturdy handle sat beside a large green button. That's the emergency release bar. And, he gestured further, pointing to the interior of the pod, there's a breather unit in stasis with each crewman, enough air to get out and do whatever was needed if the ship was voided. Bjornwolf grunted. Then what killed them? If there's still power even now, what killed them? Nathaniel's auspex beeped softly. He stared at it for a moment, then said simply, time. They all turned to him. Hjorwolf nodded slowly. True, their journey was supposed to last for hundreds, maybe 1,000 years, but clearly, the passage of so long would have killed them anyway. No, said the apothecary again. Literally time. He tapped his auspex and gestured toward the bodies. The system clearly shut off by itself. The Susan membrane had time to initiate, meaning they were alive when it happened, though not conscious. Hethrid frowned, running his scanner over a long dormant chronometer on the wall. His brow furrowed as he followed the wiring with his fingers. According to this, the ship reached its destination. The machine spirit began standard shutdown protocol. He leaned in, following more cables. Presumably, the waking procedure required a crew, but there was no crew. Nathaniel clicked his gauntleted fingers. Of course, stimulants would have been used to wake them, possibly a number of other additives, medicaments, but no one was here to administer them. Bjornwolf closed his eyes in understanding. He whispered the words like a curse. Sphera obscura. Sigibild let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Of course, the ship passed Halicarnassus Prime, gravitational shearing. He exhaled sharply. When passing too close to a black hole, neutron star, or strong gravitational anomaly, time distortions can set in. Staggered failures. The ship's chronometers must have been affected, waking the crew at the wrong time, and he gestured to the pods. So, Bjornwolf said grimly, where were the active crew? Sigibild's face hardened. Let's find the bridge. It may hold our answer. As they moved on, their lumens darting over the walls and machinery, Bjorthelm remained behind a moment longer. He knelt before the long-dead astronaut, staring at the face preserved in silent repose. He raised his hand, slowly making the sign of the Aquila. From one voidsman to another, sleep well, brother. With 2 fingers he traced a mark over his breastplate. Then, without another word, he stood and followed the others, leaving the tomb in darkness once more. Aboard the Langfarawita aft section, cryo chamber, Ranger Captain Elandros placed a hand on the cryopod, his long fingers brushing away layers of ancient dust. The pod was familiar, at least in function, not unlike those the Eldar used. Beneath the dust-covered glass, a dead face stared upward at nothing. Its eyelids were open, but the blue eyes beneath them were glazed over, clouded with a thin, gossamer film. Not quite ice, not quite flesh, something between the two. All around him, his rangers moved with silent steps, their footfalls eerily muted by the emptiness of the vast chamber. For a vessel of this size, the open space was unnatural, far too expansive, far too hollow. The outer hull and the inner hull were separated by mere meters, an inefficient design for any voidcraft. Crude, primitive. The cryotubes stretched in endless rows, clinging to the deck, the walls, the ceiling itself. Elandros looked up, watching his men tread along the roof as if they were walking a mirror image of the floor. The weightless quiet of the ship swallowed even their movements. A hushed reverence, or the silence of the dead. He frowned, eyes drifting across the chamber. No gravity plating, yet the doors were spaced too strangely for this to be a true microgravity environment. Then it struck him. This chamber was meant to rotate. A carousel, generating artificial gravity through centrifugal force. An ancient, clumsy solution, as crude as it was barbaric. The very thought made him queasy. How laughable. The builders of this vessel had barely understood the void, and yet they had dared to cast themselves into it. Their Monkey arrogance had sent them hurtling into the abyss on ships like this, barely beyond their own cradle of ignorance. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Lirashir, the Shadow Seer, was floating, perfectly still beside a cryopod, his arms folded, his masked face turned toward the dead within. He did not drift, nor twist in the lack of gravity. He simply existed as though the void itself respected his presence. "You see and you understand," he murmured. Elandros tilted his head. Did he? He looked back at the pod, at the corpse. A body, he admitted. Then he glanced across the chamber, to the endless rows of frozen sleepers, stretching beyond the reach of their lumens. A hatch at the far end led into another chamber, identical in size and purpose. He exhaled. A great many bodies. He turned back to Lirashir. "I see, but I do not understand." The Harlequin tilted his head, as if in amusement. "Is it not obvious?" Elandros spread his hands, expression blank. Nearby, several rangers paused, intrigued by the conversation. Lirashir shifted. Then, in one impossible movement, he threw himself into the air, his body twisting in a chaotic spiral. One long-fingered hand reached toward the corpse. Then his entire form jerked violently, as if struck by an unseen force. A veil of dark cloth spun free from his person, floating lazily as he convulsed midair. His limbs splayed, fingers twitching, spasming, stiffening. Then he froze, body hanging limply, like a puppet with its strings cut. The veil settled across his face like a funeral shroud. The illusion was flawless, a mockery of the corpse below. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the rangers muttered, "He means the mummification." Another scoffed. He could have just said that. Elandros ignored them. His gaze traced the corpse, the strange silken film that had cocooned it. The flesh beneath was eerily intact, its eyes still bright, still blue, still whole. This was not decay, this was preservation, suspended not by machines, but by biology itself. And suddenly he understood. His mind snapped back to battles fought against the warriors of NihtWyrtha, the way they refused to die, the way their bodies clung to life beyond reason, beyond injury, beyond hope. His eyes flicked toward Lirashir's belt, where silver warg skulls hung, trophies from a Navis Astra Wigathane command throne. He had thought little of it before. Now he understood. The Harlequin had fought them before. He had studied them, hunted them, killed them, and he had known exactly what they would find aboard this ship. Elandros' stomach coiled as he looked back at the corpse, at the truth. "These are the NihtWyrtha colonists," he murmured, voice hollow. He swept his gaze over the endless rows of the dead, at least the ones who didn't make it. The protective membrane had grown from their own flesh, and he remembered he had seen this before himself. He knew of the many augments Astartes had to make them warriors was one that behaved just like this one. Astartes did not die easily. They did not decay as men did. Their bodies fought death long after they had been struck down. He had never encountered one in battle. Their presence in the Reach was rare, almost mythical, but he had heard the stories. A horrible thought took shape. His scanner flickered. The corpse before him bore no surgical marks, no scars, no cybernetic alterations, no grafted implants. These Mon-K were born with it. Looking down at the corpse, he breathed slowly, gathering his thoughts. These were not Mon-K. The NihtWyrthans were not Mon-K. They were already a type of post-Mon-K, a step on a ladder. His breath caught. Were these proto-Astartes? Was this how it had begun? Maybe 20,000 years ago? Then another horror unfolded in his mind. What if the Imperium discovered this? For 5,000 years, the Mon-K had relied on crude, invasive surgeries to manufacture their so-called angels of death, a process so grueling that few survived it. But this was different. If the Imperium perfected this process, if Astartes could be born rather than built, he knew he was getting ahead of himself. This was just one adaptation. Doubtful the Mon-K could design a post-Mon-K to grow. But why not? With these bodies, the original material? The Imperium of Man was already a nightmare, a bloated corpse of an empire, sustained only by sheer numbers and mindless faith. But this knowledge, this would make them unstoppable. Elandros slowly turned to Lirashir, who stood waiting, silent and still. And for the first time in his long life, the ranger captain felt afraid. The Shadowseer inclined his head, as if to say, "Now you understand." Then, without a word, he lifted his palm. His other hand moved across it, slow as the turning of the stars. And when it pulled away, a spirit stone shimmered in his grasp. Deep, dark blue, empty, waiting. Elandros swallowed. "There is something else you are trying to tell me, isn't there?" he asked. Lirashir pressed a silencing finger to the lips of his mask. Then, without a sound, he reached for nothing, and pulled. As if drawing an invisible thread, he flipped backward, vanishing into a perfect cartwheel, his staff spinning in his grasp. Elandros' gut twisted. This revelation was not the end. It was merely a grain of sand in an hourglass yet to be turned. Without another word, he followed. The rangers moved in his wake. Ahead, the Harlequin disappeared into the shadows. Aboard the Langfarawita forward section, the bridge, Beornwulf took the lead, moving a few steps ahead of Captain Sigabield. Behind him, Hyorowulf had drifted back, walking alongside the techno-archaeologist, who was gesturing toward the ancient etchings that still adorned the walls. The serpentine murals did not unsettle Beornwulf. He had seen their like before. Homborg, the great mountain, was covered in similar engravings, twisting through stone like an ancient script. What held his focus was not the art, but the structure itself. The ship was built in segments. That much was clear. Why? Was it constructed on a planet, perhaps on Terra itself, then brought into orbit for assembly? It made sense. If this vessel had departed 20,000 years ago, that placed it just before stable warp travel was invented. That tracked, it explained the absence of a navigator's sphere. The navigator gene had not yet spread in abundance, and without a jump engine, this ship had no way to breach the immaterium. Yet two things bothered him as he studied the architecture and machinery. First, why? Without warp travel, why would anyone deliberately settle a colony at the very edge of the galaxy? Even in that long-lost age, the Arcana Inclusium would have been nothing but a faint dot, barely perceptible to an observatorium lens. A wasteland at the fringes of known space. What madness drove them to choose it? Second, why had these people, his people, altered their genes? The Susan membrane. Why give it to themselves? If it was so beneficial, surely all humans would have used it. But no, it appeared that only these first colonists possessed the genetic modification. What was the reason? Beornwulf felt a shadow of unease creep into his mind. This was planned, and if it was planned, by who? Brother Nathaniel walked behind the techno-archaeologist, listening as the man rambled through his observations of the mural-covered corridors. Nathaniel barely noticed. His fingers twisted absently at his augmetic hand as he walked, the mechanical digits clicking softly. Like Beornwolf, he had noticed the absence of a navigator's sphere. Like Hyorowolf, he found himself drawn to the walls, to the etched battles frozen in time. Sieges, trenches, great navies clashing upon the sea. The colonists had been warriors, well versed in the art of war long before they set foot on NihtWyrtha. It made sense. The Wigathane tradition stretched back this far into human history. He let that thought settle, turning it over in his mind. But one thing unsettled him deeply. No skulls adorned the walls. No cogwork machinery of the Mechanicus could be seen. No prayer alcoves, no hymn-etched purity seals, no data scrolls inscribed with the proper litanies of function. How did this ship even hold together without the blessings of the priesthood? No offering ports, no consecration marks, not even a sign of machine spirits being invoked. Nathaniel's unease deepened. Perhaps the rites were known only to the crew. Perhaps shrines were hidden in recesses, but he saw nothing. A ship unblessed, a ghost vessel drifting through the void, held together by nothing but the will of the dead. Beornwolf raised his lumen, the beam cutting through the dim corridor. Ahead, a sealed hatch loomed, heavy, perhaps a bulkhead. He called back over his shoulder, just as Siggebield came alongside. "Bridge must be beyond, if my yard count is right." Siggebield nodded, slowing his pace. "I counted the same." He stopped, resting a gloved hand on the hilt of his sword. His eyes drifted toward Hathrad as the tech adept moved forward. He exhaled. "I wonder if the crew are still—" He did not finish the thought. He would not speak the words aloud. None of them knew what had happened to the waking crew. What kind of men chose to live their lives and die on such a voyage? They had never expected to live long enough to see their new home. And yet, they had brought with them a naval tradition that still endured in Siggebield's world today. Hathrad plugged a winding handle into a socket, securing it in place. He set his stance, then began to turn the crank. Metal groaned as ancient locks disengaged. The bulkhead shuddered. Slowly, the doors ground open, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The lumens lit the void ahead. And beyond, the tomb of the bridge awaited them. Beyond, darkness beckoned beyond. Beornwolf stepped through and onto the bridge of the Langfarwita. It was nothing like an imperial ship. The consoles were low, embedded into the deck, each with a chair behind it. Not arranged for authority, but for efficiency. A design for collaboration, not command. One seat was larger, the navigator's station, judging by the instrumentation. The command chair was even stranger. It was not fixed to the deck, but suspended from the ceiling, designed to rotate freely between the consoles. Unlike imperial bridge thrones, it was built for function, not ceremony. And it was empty. Bodies drifted in the air around them. Men and women long dead, their flesh locked in preservation of Unkwilm slop, their forms hanging motionless, untouched by time. Beornwolf stood among them, staring into the faces of his ancestors. The men and women who had crossed the void before the Imperium existed, who had come here without warp travel, without navigators, without the Emperor's hand to guide them. They had chosen to cast themselves into the abyss, and here, in the darkness, they had died. He also wondered if any of them had truly understood what they and their 6 sister ships had set in motion. Siggebield stepped up beside him. "I wonder which one is the captain," he mused. Beornwolf stared at the silent bridge, at the frozen dead. They must have all died at once, otherwise someone would have cleared the bodies. He reached up, gently catching the arm of the corpse. The body was stiff and frozen, more like a block of ice than a man who had once breathed and fought. He pulled the crewman down, and Hyorowolf took a leg, lowering the long-lost voidsman carefully onto the deck. Around them, Beorthelm's men did the same, moving with reverence. Nathaniel knelt beside one of the bodies, his auspex flashing, the soft hum of its sensors breaking the stillness. Siggebield moved toward the command chair, a stark thing of dark metal, its once polished surface dulled by the ages. He seated himself, feeling the cold weight of it, as if the ghosts of the past still lingered there. The bridge was dead, the consoles dark, but from here he could see everything. The layout was perfect, designed for efficiency and control, a captain's domain where the entire bridge crew could be monitored with a single glance. He realized the true brilliance of the design. The throne was automated, not just for ease of movement, but because the bridge had been built for zero gravity. In combat, in flight, the crew would have been strapped into their stations, weightless in the void, while the captain moved between them on command. No need for steps or walkways, just pure function. He turned his gaze to the forward viewport, where only the void stared back. They had drifted in darkness for 20 millennia, alone. Sigurbild exhaled, about to push himself from the chair when his fingers brushed against something. A catch, hidden in the side of the armrest. He traced the edge of it with his glove, then pressed it open. Inside, at first, he thought he had found a data scribe, a device of some kind. But as he pulled it free, he realized it was a book, an actual paper book bound in worn leather, its pages brittle and yellowed with time. Carefully, he lifted the cover. The edges of the pages threatened to crumble, but the book had remained open to a single readable passage. A stylus drifted in the air nearby. Sigurbild caught it, then slotted it into an obvious holder at the spine of the book. He frowned. The writing was in an early Wirthan script, a form so ancient it was likely lost to time. But something caught his eye, a series of calculations. Mathematics never aged. He traced the lines of figures, recognizing what they meant. Velocity, mass, the effect of a gravity well. Interesting. He ran the numbers again in his head, then felt a deep chill creep through his body. The captain of the Langfarawita had known. The calculations were precise, far too precise to be speculation. The captain had been fully aware of Sphera Obscura, the black hole that had once been Hālgengas Prime. From the figures, Sigurbild could see it clearly. The star had collapsed just 47 years into their journey. They must have seen the warning signs. The Langfarawita had altered its course, adjusting its trajectory toward NihtWyrtha despite the time differential. And then he saw it, a marginal note in the captain's hand. A quick calculation, hurried but methodical, for 2 other craft. The dead captain had known that 2 other ships had been following them, and he had realized they would never make it. He had calculated their own course, warned them. He had done all he could not just for his own ship, but the other 2 captains following. For the Langfarawita, even with everything, even after sacrificing one of their shuttles as a booster to increase their speed, it had not been enough. They had fought against time itself and lost. Yet the crew had done everything they could to save their cargo, to ensure their people would one day reach their new home. They had steered a course even after encountering an uncharted black hole, its gravitational tides pulling at their vessel, dragging them further and further from their original path. And still, they had held fast. With no warp travel, no aid, and no hope, they had kept the course, navigating the abyss with sheer skill, and still guiding their ship toward NihtWyrtha, though 20,000 years late. It was a remarkable piece of navigation, one that should be taught in the halls of the Wiser Academia, a lesson in perseverance. Even when they must have known the odds were against them, they had kept going. They had sailed into the black Geofon of the void, into the cold abyss of fate. Vague word. If ever the term had meaning, it was here. Sigurbild let out a slow breath, looking down at the fragile pages of the captain's log. And now the Langfarawita had arrived at its destination, more or less. These men, these long-lost travelers, had fought against time itself, knowing they would never live to see the world they sought to reach. And yet, they had faced their fate with honor. A sense of deep respect settled in his chest. He felt a kinship with the long-dead captain, a man he had never met but whom he now understood. A captain who had died at his post, making the final choices that would ensure others lived on. Sigubild's grip tightened around the book, and he gave the faintest of nods, as if acknowledging a brother across time. "You did not fail, Captain." He stood, slipping the logbook carefully back into its compartment. Brother Nathaniel's voice broke Sigubild's reverie. The apothecary straightened to his full height, his black armor casting shifting shadows in the flickering lumens. He had finished his examination of the last body. The crew's bodies tell a strange tale. His voice was even. All of them died at the same time. It looks like gravitational shearing. They died of shock when the ship ran over a gravity wave. Nathaniel glanced down at the frozen, still features of the long-dead voidsmen. A few more minutes, and they would have been in cryo. They would have been safe. His red augmetic eye pulsed dimly as he swept his gaze across the dead. "Why a few more minutes?" asked Beornwolf. The lumens flashed between Nathaniel's armored form and the frozen bodies. "They're all wearing compression suits, all have tranq patches attached. And I'm detecting a high concentration of pre-sedation relaxants." He twisted his augmetic hand absently, his voice heavy. "I think they were preparing to enter cryo." Beornwolf looked down at the crewman he had lain to rest. "So they almost made it?" His voice was quiet, the weight of it settling over the bridge. Hethred unplugged himself from a primitive cogitator, the ancient machine whining softly as its interface powered down. It accepted no litanies, but a simple request for data had worked. He cast his servo arm around the bridge, taking in the silent consoles, the black screens where once had been a guiding hand, a crew, a future. "That makes sense." His mechanical voice was unreadable, but the solemnity in it was unmistakable. The crew had shut down all non-essential systems, including life support. They halted hull rotation, put the reactor into slow burn. They were going to sleep through the millennia. Beornwolf exhaled, his helmet tilting slightly toward the still forms around them. Could they have done it? Could they have survived? Could they have slept through eternity, only to wake to a world that had long forgotten them? Hethrid's lumens flickered, reflecting off the Beornwolf's faceplate. Yes, the ship's systems had at least 3 redundancy failsafes. He glanced toward the other sleeper chamber, where the silent dead lay entombed. "The crew we found there, they died because no one was left to wake them. They never activated a backup chronometer. They never made it to the cryopods." He gestured to a wall-mounted machine, its surface still holding residual charge, pulsing faintly with forgotten power. "They deployed a ram scoop, archaic by our standards, but it would have provided sufficient fuel to keep the ship running." He shrugged, his servo arm clicking softly. It did. Sigebield let out a slow breath, his gaze moving from the consoles to the lost crewman. "So they almost made it," he murmured. The words hung in the still air, but almost meant nothing in the cold depths of the void. Sigebield took one last look around the bridge. "Let's see the colonists. There may be little to be salvaged, but at least we can pay our respects." With that, he departed the bridge. Aboard the Navis Astra Wigathine shuttlecraft Speauglass, Edric peered out of the viewport, his hand resting against his cheek. The Langfarawita spanned the windows, long and sleek, its lack of Gothic architecture unsettling, a relic from a far-flung age. To his imperial eyes, it looked almost Xenos, as if humanity itself had built something beyond its time. Yet something else was out there, latched onto the colony ship, but he couldn't see it, and his auspex couldn't detect it. So how could he find it? And what was worse, what was it doing? Probably a boarding craft. His first instinct was to warn the expedition team, but what would that accomplish? First, there was little they could do about it. Second, they were already on guard. Third, what if it was nothing? A sensor glitch? Still, it didn't hurt to look. If there was a ship out there, who would it be? Drakari? They had stealth runners. That was a real threat in the Arcana Inclusium. Eldari? Possible, but he'd only ever heard of a few encounters with the Eldar in the entire Reach. Olgarith? He frowned. Were they still around? The war ended 3 years ago, and as far as anyone knew, they'd fled east into the wastelands. But Olgarith's scoutcraft did have stealth capabilities. Edric rubbed the irritation beneath his augmetic eye. "Do you remember the war?" He broke the silence. Osbjorn held up his augmetic hand and tapped the scar on his cheek. "I was a fireship pilot," he said flatly. Edric blinked. He hadn't known that. Fireships, the old, worn-out vessels used as rams against the Olgarith dreadnoughts, piloted close before the Voidsman ejected, leaving the final approach to servitors. A death sentence if you mistimed it. Voidsman, Hafoxton added, arms folded, boarded a couple of ships, repelled a couple. That, at least, Edric already knew. He looked back out at the void, lost in thought. "Remember the Olgarith stealth ships?" Hafoxton shook his head. "Not my part of the war, only saw inside them." Osbjorn nodded slowly. "Heard about them, never saw one." Edric rubbed his eye augment, trying to connect the pieces. "They used a chameleonic cloak, bioengineered, but they were detectable," he continued, "by analyzing thermal decay patterns. Lingering heat signatures, differences in background radiation, those gave them away." Osbjorn adjusted his auspex, isolating thermal imaging. Hafoxton, intrigued, did the same. using the targeting cogitators instead. Nothing. Both men sat back. Osbjorn absently switched back to standard settings. Then he frowned, rubbing his forehead in concentration. Edric buried his face in his hands. He had tried everything. Still nothing. If there was another ship latched onto the hull, the moment he moved to pick up the team, they'd be in danger. Osbjorn abruptly fired the lateral thrusters, turning the shuttle slightly. Edric looked up sharply. "What are you doing?" Osbjorn flipped several switches, running a system purge of the shuttle's thruster banks. "Venting stored xenon and refilling the thrusters," he said casually. Edric narrowed his eyes. "Is there a problem with them?" Osbjorn grinned. "Ships do it all the time, to make sure there are no leaks or thrust failure issues," he said matter-of-factly. "Anyone watching us will think it's a standard purge after station keeping." Edric exhaled, watching him carefully. "But in reality, this is a Mechanicus shuttle." Osborne leaned back in his seat, his augmetic fingers tapping the console. "Navis Astra Wigathane ships use hydrazine for maneuvering thrusters, but the Mechanicus?" He paused, raising a finger. "They use charged xenon." Edric's eyes widened as he understood. Osbjorn's grin widened. "Electromagnetic acceleration system." But, he leaned in slightly, xenon ionization leaves an iron trail. As the shuttle moved back toward its original position, Edric reactivated the auspex. The vented xenon ions dispersed into the void, a faint, invisible shower washing over the Langfarwita. Then it appeared, at first just a shimmer, then a glow brightening. An aphenleoma, a cold aurora borealis forming where ionized gas interacted with the ship's magnetic field. And there it was, a shape, black as night, perched like a limpet on the aft engine section of the relic ship. At first it looked like a shadow, an absence of light. But now, Edric could see its outline, the faint starlight glinting off a smooth, curved hull. His mouth dried as he stared. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. Not Imperial, not Olgarith. Osbjorn drew a slow breath, his hands tightening on the controls. The ominous gull wings hung down each side, but this one had a larger belly section, almost certainly for crew transport. Osbjorn knew the shape instantly. His first month on patrol with the Imperial Navy. His first battle. The battle that left his battleship crippled and half its crew dead. "It's an Eldari vampire raider." Edric nodded slowly. "Our autocannon would be useless against its ablative hull. And this shuttle has rocket pods instead of lascannons. They won't lock on." Hafokstan grinned, turning in his seat. "This shuttle is of manifold dawn design, a gift from Feruvis to General Tiberius after the Orc War." He jabbed a thumb upward. "It has a ball turret." Edric grinned. A plan was forming. He reached for his personal vox, flicking it open as he spoke. Aboard the Langfarwita midsection, cryo chamber. Sigabield lowered his hand from the vox, his expression unreadable. Bjornwolf, walking just behind him, caught the shift in body language. "Captain?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was a tension now. Something was wrong. Heorwolf, walking alongside the techno-archaeologist, saw Bjornwolf's lowered hand make a quick battle sign, a signal to be on guard. Without hesitation, he adjusted his position, moving slightly ahead of the old man, a subtle, protective motion. They kept walking, but the air felt different now. Up ahead, Bjorthelm led his voidsmen through the vast colonist sleeper bay. The space was immense, more like a cavern than a ship's interior. He looked upward, realizing that the ceiling was not a ceiling at all. It was another floor. Where up was down and down was up, voidsmen walked along opposite-facing floors, their boots secured by maglocks moving in perfect counterbalance among thousands of dark cryopods. They were in an unintended tomb. Ranger Captain Elandros crouched behind a cryopod, his camellia-line cloak seamlessly blending him into the shadows. Around him, spread along the vaulted walls and ceiling, his 5 rangers waited in silence, their long rifles steady, their breath controlled. This vast chamber, the tomb of a forgotten people, was now their battlefield. Ahead, 30 Mon K soldiers entered the massive space, moving in tight formation. Not an overwhelming force. They had the drop on them. Had he known the Imperials would be here, he would have brought at least a squad or 2 of Guardians. Curse whatever god led us to this moment. Elandros studied them carefully. There, a figure in an ornate void suit, flanked by another man with a sword of rank. Officers, commanders of this barbarian detachment. Then, the black-armored figure of an Astartes, towering over the others. Its inhuman bulk was unmistakable. His blood ran cold, colder than normal, and Astartes. No matter, one could be dealt with. He turned, intending to signal Shadowseer Lyrishir, but the Harlequin was gone, vanished. Elandros rolled his eyes, typical. He never trusted the Laughing God's followers. They appeared when they wished, spoke in riddles, and vanished when needed most. Elandros let them pass deeper, ensuring they would be fully surrounded by his men's interlocking fire. It was the brilliance of this ship's design. With high and low ground at his disposal, there was nowhere to hide. No matter. The Monkey had walked into the killing ground. Ahead, a squad of voidsmen moved cautiously. Bjorthelm led his voidsmen ahead of the party through the ambush zone, oblivious to the trap. His vox crackled to life. The voice of the captain, tense but controlled. "We have company." Bornwolf whipped his head around, scanning the vast, shadowed hall. His senses sharpened, his heartbeat pounded. Elandros smiled. Then, the lead voidsman stopped. He raised a hand, fingers flickering in precise battle sign. Elandros didn't understand the Monkey's crude signals. They could have shouted for all he cared. Their language was nothing but guttural gibberish to his ears. Then the voidsmen began to fall back, quickly, covering their retreat. Too late. Elandros gave the fire order over the comlink, and then he went blind. In a single, fluid motion, Bjornwolf pulled a flare round from his belt, slotted it onto the barrel of his Serpenta, and fired. "Photon!" he shouted as the round detonated. Anything could be lurking in the dancing light of their lumens. Then, his practiced eye caught it. A shadow that did not move. Another, higher up, clinging to the ceiling. Active camouflage. The camellia-line cloaked figures were now fully exposed, their stealth fields failing to adjust fast enough against the overwhelming flare. A miniature star ignited, flooding the entire hall with a blinding, white-hot burst of pure light. Voidsman glare-shielded visors snapped shut. Ranger Captain Elandros shook his head, disoriented. His Eldari eyes, normally capable of perceiving both normal light and infrared and ultraviolet spectrums, were failing him. The photon flare was momentarily blinded him. His ability to see infrared and ultraviolet was gone. The dull, dimly lit ship, combined with the flickering lumens and scattered lasfire, made the battlefield a swirling, chaotic mess to his now dulled perception. Nearby, a voidsman screamed, his hands clutching at the vision slit of his helmet, his retinas burned beyond repair. Even within his sealed void suit, the sound cut through Elandros' enhanced hearing, grating like a discordant chime. The noise irritated him. With a shaky movement, he rose, stepping toward the voidsman, and cut him down with a casual flick of his sword. Another voidsman had taken cover behind a cryopod, firing at one of his scouts. Elandros barely cared. With an absent gesture, he shot the cryopod's control panel, venting frozen gases in a burst that engulfed the Monkey in ice and mist. Still, something was wrong. One of his men was dead. The others were returning fire, but their accuracy was terrible. This wasn't working. His vision was still unfocused, his movements off balance. Then he saw him, the alien officer, withdrawing. No, that would not do. He charged. Two voidsmen turned, lasguns raised, and fired. Normally he would have dodged, but his reflexes, once preternatural, were dulled by the lingering blindness and the weighted maglocks on his void boots. The first round bounced off his armor. The second pierced his thigh. Pain flared through him. Snarling, he kicked off a cryopod, leaping backward, intending to land behind the two Monkey, cutting them down in a single fluid strike. Instead, he overshot, missed his mark. He flew between them, his blade bisecting one, but the other escaped his reach as he smashed through a cryopod. Glass shattered. His body crashed into the frozen corpse within, sending a cloud of ancient, gossamer-like material swirling through the zero-gravity air. Dazed, he tried to rise. Pain lanced through his back. The second voidsman had driven a blade into his shoulder, right between his armor plates. Elandros snarled in rage, swinging wildly at the Monkey, but the voidsman blocked the strike with his rifle. His anger deepened. Without thinking, he lashed out with his foot, kicking the voidsman in the gut, sending him hurtling into another cryopod. Elandros steadied himself. Before him, two more voidsmen drifted in zero gravity, their life's blood leaking into the cold void. His men had taken them with their rifles. He smiled. Beyond them, the Monkey officer. He advanced. Sigurbield fired his bolt pistol like he was in the Welsik shooting range. Last rounds from the Voidsman burned through the shadows. Serpenta blasts from the Wigathane cut through the shimmering cloaks. Plasma bolts and last shots deflected off the light armor underneath. One Eldar scout recovered quickly, regaining just enough vision to raise his long rifle. His target, Captain Sigurbield. Bjornwolf saw and fired, but the Serpenta round bounced off the scout's armor. However, the first shot from the long rifle missed. Bjornwolf charged Sigurbield, knocking him to the deck, the next rounds just missing him. Brother Nathaniel, he raised his bolt pistol, his black gauntlet steady as death itself. 3 cracks. Rocket-propelled bolts tore through the scout's armor like it was made of tin plate. The Eldar convulsed, his torso exploding as Xeno's blood sprayed into zero gravity. The body drifted weightless, a lifeless puppet in the void. "It would be advisable to fall back to the shuttle," he shouted. Sigurbield got to one knee. He nodded to Bjornwolf in thanks, then ordered, "Bjorthelm, pull your men back." Bjornwolf watched as the techno-archaeologist, flanked by Hathred and Hjorwolf, slipped through the bulkhead into the shuttle bay. Good, he thought. At least the old man was safe. He noted Hathred working the door crank, locking it down. Ahead, Bjorthelm and his Voidsmen fought a desperate retreat, moving through the vast colonist sleeper bay. The chamber stretched endlessly, rows upon rows of dead colonists sleeping eternally. The space was like a tomb, the only illumination coming from the panicked dance of lumen beams and the flares of last fire. A sharp shuriken sliced through the darkness, slamming into Bjorthelm's cover. He rolled aside as the Eldari scout stepped over the crumpled form of a Voidsman, his shuriken pistol raised for the killing shot. Bjornwolf snapped up his Serpenta, the crack of his pistol echoing through the hall, but the rounds skittered harmlessly off the Eldari's armor. The Xenos turned his attention to him now, his shuriken pistol swiveling in his grip. Bjorthelm took his chance. The Void Captain lunged, a noddle in his grip, the thin blade slipping through the scout's helmet with a brutal crack. With a grunt, Bjorthelm slammed the pommel down, driving the weapon's narrow spike through the Eldari's skull and into his brain. The scout stood motionless, blood curling into zero gravity like black ribbons. Dead. Bjorthelm dragged the wounded Voidsman behind him, heading for the shuttle bay's bulkhead hatch. Hathred waving them in. Hathred pulled the wounded Voidsman through the hatch, handing him off to Hjorwolf, who carefully laid the stricken man on the deck. Bjorthelm was already at work, pressing a sealant patch over the breach in the man's armor. The air in the ship was thin, but not lethal. He would survive. Hjorwolf checked the man's breather tube, ensuring his oxygen levels remained stable. Bjorthelm placed a steadying hand on his pauldron. Bjornwolf and Sigurbield covered them as they withdrew. A green glowing round sliced through one of Bjornwolf's men and hit the captain. Sigurbield cursed, grabbing at his arm as blood streamed from his palm. A shuriken disc had sliced through his hand, sending his bolt pistol spinning into the void. He turned, drawing Tempest's bite, his eyes locked onto the approaching Eldari. Bjornwolf followed his gaze and saw the Xenos warrior charging. Sword raised, a ranger captain. Bjornwolf let go of his Serpenta, knowing it was useless, and drew his Seeks, shouting a warning. Nathaniel stepped in front of them, his black armor towering over the Voidsman, bolt pistol raised. Shuriken rounds spat against his armor, deflecting harmlessly, the refractor field around him flaring against the impacts. 2 squads of Voidsmen formed a tight firing line, Lazarafel spitting red beams, but Elandros moved like a ghost, twisting between shots. Nathaniel fired. Heavy bolt rounds roared down the hall, each shot perfectly placed, as though an invisible line had been drawn between him and the charging ranger captain. The Eldari's refractor field flared brilliantly, deflecting the rounds, sparks arcing off his armor. Then, in a blur of motion, Elandros closed the gap. Nathaniel stepped back with practiced ease, turning his pauldron into the strike. Elandros's blade skidded across the ceramite with a piercing screech. Nathaniel hammered the Xenos in the chest with his bolt pistol, knocking him back, and raised the weapon to fire, but his grip slipped. A lifetime habit of twisting the ring on his augmetic wrist had betrayed him. The bolt round glanced off Elandros's helmet, failing to find the mark. The ranger captain did not hesitate. In one flawless movement, he pressed his shuriken pistol against Nathaniel's knee joint and fired. A spray of sealant foam burst from the wound, and Nathaniel staggered, his balance thrown. Elandros spun his blade, the hilt crashing into the apothecary's helmet with brutal force. Nathaniel slammed into a cryopod, momentarily stunned. A voidsman fired desperately, only for Elandros to cut through him with a contemptuous slash, his armor peeling apart like wet paper. Bornwolf pushed another voidsman aside, parrying a downward blade strike meant for him. With a quick, precise lunge, he aimed his sea axe at Elandros' thigh and wrist, a crippling, killing cut. But the Eldari wasn't there. Elandros twisted to the side, his sword punching through Bornwolf's chest plate. The blade's tip ground against his ribs, his gorget arresting its full force just short of puncturing his lung. Bjornwolf grabbed the Eldari's pistol hand, shoving the weapon upward just as the trigger was pulled. Shuriken rounds spat into the vast chamber instead of into his skull. Elandros simply drew back and kicked him in the chest, sending Bornwolf sprawling onto the deck. Pain flooded his body, his ribs cracked, his breath ragged. Through his blurring vision, he saw Elandros' sword coming down for the kill. Siggebield had stepped forward, his power sword clashing against the Xeno's weapon, sparks showering the deck between them. The two warriors locked eyes, and Siggebield spoke one word, Fagword. Elandros jerked his sword free, stepping back to assess his opponent. A voidsman charged him with a noddle in one hand and a seax in the other. Elandros turned, raising his pistol. Shuriken rounds shredded the voidsman, unraveling his armor in an outward bloom of red mist. Then Tempest's bite came down. The power sword sheared through Elandros' shuriken pistol, the weapon exploding in his hand. A searing bolt of pain shot through him, his fingers bursting apart in an explosion of ruined flesh and armor. Elandros staggered, barely blocking the next strike. He screamed in fury, cursing the gods. His anger boiled over. The restraint of a ranger captain was gone. How dared this Mon Kay think he could fight him? He, Ranger Captain Elandros, brother of the striking scorpions, keeper of the red stone, oath-sworn defender of Anaris Elthier, he had walked this galaxy for 1,000 years. This creature, this short-lived, pathetic thing had barely seen 50 summers. Unacceptable. Elandros lunged, snarling. Siggebield met him. The first strike cut through his chest plate, his own blood spilling into the void in a fine spray. The second shattered his sword. The third ripped through his helmet, sending the top half spinning into the darkness. Elandros crashed to the deck, stunned, his face gashed open, air spilling from his armor. Gasping, blood pooling in his breather, he glared at the humans. "Damned Mon Kai!" he coughed. 3 voidsmen approached, blades raised. Elandros gritted his teeth, the taste of his own blood thick in his mouth. Damn them all. The 3 voidsmen raised their blades over Ranger Captain Elandros, their weapons gleaming in the scattered lumen light, their intent clear. Then the laughter came. A whisper of silk and shadow, a blur of red and white, and suddenly Shadowseer Lyrashir was there. He dropped from above, landing with a graceful pirouette, the soft tap of his boots barely audible before he sprang into motion. His staff whirled, the monofilament blade extending in a whisper-thin arc. Before the voidsman could react, one was already dead. The first collapsed, his chest split open, his breath escaping in a silent gasp as blood misted into zero gravity. The second stepped back, bringing up his rifle. Lyrashir twisted, slipping through the air like a falling ribbon, his mask flashing in the shifting lights. His blade wove a story of death, carving through the second man's throat in a perfect, fluid arc. The third voidsman lunged, his natal flicking out, but Lyrashir was already gone, his form shifting and twisting, dodging with impossible grace until, a flick of the wrist, a cut too fine to see. The third voidsman froze, his body suspended in the void. Then he came apart. The monofilament filament had sliced through his armor, flesh and bone, as though they were paper. Lyrashir landed lightly, one foot resting upon the severed head of a voidsman, his staff twirling in one hand. A dozen more voidsmen rushed forwards against the new threat, weapons raised. Lyrashir bowed theatrically, as though about to perform for a great audience, and spread his arms in welcome. The voidsmen charged, but the Shadowseer moved before they even knew it. To them, it must have seemed as though he was everywhere at once. Last fire cut through the air, but Lyrashir was already gone, twisting, leaping, moving as though the very void carried him. The monofilament ribbon in his staff flicked outward. A head rolled. He landed lightly upon the shoulders of another, his foot driving them down into a pod with bone-breaking force. He flipped backward, using the corpse as a springboard, his blade lashing out again. A stomach opened. A chest split apart, blood turned to mist. More voidsmen fell, their lives ended in the space of a breath. Siggebield charged, Tempest's bite slicing through the darkness, the captain unwilling to let this monster slaughter his men unchecked. Their blades met in a clash of light and shadow. Siggebield's power sword carved downward, but Lyrishir danced away, laughing as he twisted. A flourish, a sidestep, a mocking twirl. The Shadowseer was toying with him. Siggebield pressed forward, his blade cutting through air, striking only where the Harlequin had just been. With inhuman agility, Lyrishir sidestepped the final thrust and struck low, his staff sweeping Siggebield's legs. The Voidsman captain hit the deck hard but rolled into a crouch, bringing up Tempest's bite just in time to deflect the killing stroke. The Harlequin's mask hovered inches from his face, the hollow, empty eyes staring. "A tale well played, Monkey," Lyrishir whispered. Then a gunshot. Nathaniel fired a bolt round, the explosive shell streaking towards the Shadowseer. Lyrishir twisted, the bullet skimming his shoulder as he backflipped away. The Astartes apothecary advanced, his leg wound slowing him only slightly. "You are fast, Xenos," Nathaniel growled, "but your tricks will not save you." "Perhaps not," Lyrishir said in perfect Gothic, tilting his head. "But you bleed all the same." Nathaniel swung his bolt pistol up, but Lyrishir was already moving, his staff flashing downward. A crack of metal on ceramite. Nathaniel stumbled, his augmetic wrist failing as the Harlequin's strike severed key servos. The apothecary retaliated, throwing a brutal punch, but Lyrishir sidestepped smoothly, his blade carving a deep gouge across Nathaniel's chest plate. The Astartes staggered back, his wound seeping blood into zero gravity. Siggebield came again, Tempest's bite singing through the air, but Lyrishir caught it upon his staff. The power sword flared with energy, the crackle of disruption fields sending arcs of lightning into the air. The Harlequin's weapon trembled, then shattered. For the first time, Lyrishir's laughter stopped. Lyrishir stepped back, unarmed, but his movements were still relaxed, casual, like an actor awaiting his cue. Then, Beornwulf stepped forward. His armor was dented, bloodied, patched with sealant pads, but his grip on his sea-axe was steady. He stood between the Harlequin and his wounded comrades. Lyrishir watched him closely, his head tilting. "You challenge me, Monkey?" the Harlequin purred. Beornwulf raised his blade, his voice like iron. "Fagward Surlith," Lyrishir smiled beneath his mask. "Ah, fated doom." He understood Wirthan, at least enough for their battle cry. But the Monkey understood Drukhari too? And to be called a fool by a jester? He bowed, and in flawless Drukhari he asked, "What do you fight for, human?" Beornwulf's reply was without hesitation, "Our land, our soil." Lyrishir's stance shifted slightly. He held out a hand to invite his opponent to make the first move. Then the dance began. Beornwulf made a feint. Lyrishir moved fast, taking advantage of a simply ploy, his blade flicking out, light as silk, quick as thought. Beornwulf sidestepped, the razor-thin edge barely missing his throat. His Sikhs darted forward. He had turned his feint into a real attack now with the Harlequin's guard. But Lyrishir twisted, turning the blade aside with the barest flick of his wrist. The Harlequin's movements were perfect, but Beornwulf had something different. He had no fear. He fought with guile, not discipline, every movement precise, whether it were a ploy or real, and always brutal, efficient. Lyrishir danced, but Beornwulf was not fooled by theatrics. He pressed forward, relentless. A cut to the wrist, a nick across the ribs. The Harlequin was bleeding. Lyrishir staggered back for the first time in his life, wounded in close combat with a Monkey. The two warriors stood still, breathing heavily, the battle around them slowing, reduced to Laz rounds and ill-aimed rounds from long rifles. Lyrishir stared at the blood on his glove. He had never been wounded before. And worse, it was by one of these crude creatures with their brief, flickering lives. This fight was not one to be sung unless it be a lament. The battle was not important to him. It was the lesson he was here for. He glanced down at the wounded Elandros. Then he laughed softly. He looked at Beornwulf, his mask betraying nothing, but in his voice there was something like respect. Slowly, he bowed. "This is not your time or place," he said cryptically, speaking fluent Wirthan with only a slight Eldari emphasis on vowels. Beornwulf watched him. He understood his own situation too. They could fight. The victory could still go either way, but the victory would be hollow. Panting hard, he returned the gesture, his grip on his sex still steady. For now, at least. A silent truce was formed. Beornwulf looked to Sigibald, who nodded. They backed off, Nathaniel helping the captain while carrying a wounded voidsman. In moments they were through the bulkhead, and Hethred brought the heavy door down. As the hatch slid closed, sealing the chamber, Beornwulf never took his eyes off the masked face of the Harlequin. Lyrashir stood motionless, framed in the flickering lumen glow, his head tilted ever so slightly, the unreadable expression of his mask concealing whatever thoughts swirled beneath. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into the folds of his cloak. From some unseen pocket he pulled forth a bolt of blue silk, the fabric shimmering like starlight in the dim void. Without a word, he knelt, placing the cloth delicately upon the deck. The blood from his wounded wrist seeped into the fabric, staining the deep azure with streaks of crimson. Then the Harlequin moved. Not to fight, not to flee. Instead, he struck a pose, a figure of tragedy, frozen in silent mourning. His arms folded across his chest, his head bowed, the lines of his body mimicking a sorrowful character in some ancient, forgotten performance. A gesture of lament, of fate, of something lost. Beornwulf felt a chill pass over him. He did not understand its meaning, but something in his gut twisted. He had a feeling the Xenos was warning him of something. A prophecy spoken without words. Before on the Geofon the warp ghost of the bride had given him visions. He had assumed images of the past, the ghost's own past. It or she had shown him a cavern, deep beneath low halls, too short to be built by men. A lake, frozen and black. Beneath its ice, figures hung still, warped shapes. A long claw twitched. Something beneath began to wake. In the caverns under Nithelm he had seen the vision come true, but he had assumed the vision was from when the Nithtaetan were frozen millennia ago. Not a vision of a future event he had then experienced. But he was doubting himself. Was it of that moment? The second vision was of a wedding gown, blue silk, soaked in red wine, drifting in a slow, weightless swirl. He had assumed the spirit was showing her own wedding gown from the past. The myth told that the pilot died on her wedding day. But what if it was not what she was showing him? But from the future? The Harlequin held the bolt of blue silk the same way. Was the vision shown by the bride of this moment? But he had a gut feeling that was the wrong interpretation. He felt the Harlequin was showing him a warning, something about to happen, not something that had happened. A fated doom yet to come. He made a mental note to look out for blue silk wedding gowns and avoid them in future. He gave a nod to the Harlequin, who returned the gesture. And then, the hatch sealed shut. The Harlequin lost to shadow. Beornwulf turned and moved down the dark corridor, clutching his chest, trying to keep his breathing steady. Beornthum was at his side, helping him stay upright, preventing him from losing grip on the deck or slamming into the walls or ceiling in the zero gravity. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. "What was that?" Beornthum panted, still catching his breath. Beornwulf glanced at him, noting the hastily patched wounds on his comrade, sealed with void patches. "Harlequin," he rasped, his voice catching in his throat. Now that the battle was over and the adrenaline was fading, he felt the creeping weight of shock settling in. Beornthum gave him an arm to steady himself. "What are the Harlequins doing on this relic?" he asked, not expecting the answer. Beornwulf held onto his arm as he stumbled. "I think he came to give a message." "Do Harlequins often give messages by killing the recipient?" Beornthum asked. Beornwulf winced in pain. He replayed the battle in his mind. "I don't think any of this was planned. This battle was not intended. Otherwise they would have been better armed and supported. As for the Harlequin, I think it only engaged us because he was defending the Eldari officer. I think the Harlequin found this ship and led the scouts to it, because I think it's the same one who helped Braylon and the others to escape Hollow Crown Station. I saw its glyph earlier but didn't put it together until now." Beornthum pulled Beornwulf along. Well, if you meet this Harlequin again, ask it to send a letter rather than kill 3 of my men. Beornwulf patted him on the back. If a Harlequin wanted us dead, we would be, and if I see it again, I have more than one question for it. Hathred moved swiftly behind them, pausing only at each open hatch to crank it closed with a metal bar. A single, unwounded voidsman covered him, keeping his lasgun trained on the passageways ahead. Despite the effort of sealing the ship behind them, they were keeping pace. They reached the shuttle bay access where they had first entered. Nathaniel was already waiting for them, leaning against the bulkhead, a borrowed lasgun resting casually in his augmented grip. He lifted his helmet slightly as they approached. "So, you're still breathing?" he called, smirking. "I owe Hjorwulf a case of ale." Beornwulf scowled through gritted teeth. "Your vote of confidence is duly noted." Bjorthelm gave a short, breathless laugh. "I'll have my brother send one to you free of charge." As they reached the shuttle door, Beornwulf suddenly put out a blocking hand, dead serious. "You do know I never liked NihtWyrtha ale." Bjorthelm clapped him lightly on the shoulder before glancing at Nathaniel. "This man has serious concussion." Inside the shuttle, Edric was seated in the pilot's chair next to Osbjorn, who was flicking switches and running final system checks. The rest of the crew were strapped in place, though 12 seats remained empty. The unspoken weight of that loss hung in the cabin like a ghost. Beornwulf sank into the seat across from Hjorwulf, who sat stiffly, staring at his weapon resting across his knees. Beside him, the old techno-archaeologist was bundled in his rust-red robes, arms tucked around himself as if trying to ward off the cold. Shock, Beornwulf figured. The man had likely never seen combat in his life, and yet he was here, alive, thanks to Hjorwulf. "Everyone, hold on," Osborne called back. "This is going to be tricky." Beornwulf exhaled sharply, his ribs screaming with the motion. There was still an Eldari ship out there. What exactly had Osborne planned? He glanced at Sigabild, who was too wounded to fly and so was seated in the Auspex seat, catching the captain's smirk. That was never a good sign. He leaned back into his seat, wincing as he pulled the straps painfully over his battered chest plate. It would be a terrible shame if, after all of this, they were shot out of the void the moment they exited. He closed his eyes, waiting, his last thought lingering on a bolt of blue silk. Aboard the Navis Astra Wigathane shuttlecraft Spealglass. Osbjorn gingerly touched the controls, feeling the subtle vibrations as the Navicula Imperatoria detached from the airlock, hovering gently within the vast canopy of the docking bay. Above them, the Eldari vampire raider lay in wait, perched silently like a predatory bird, resting atop the docking bay doors. It had waited for them to retrieve the expedition team, likely calculating the perfect moment to eliminate shuttle and crew in one swift strike. A mistake on their part. Osbjorn had no intention of letting them correct it. He paused and glanced at Edric, who sat watching him with an amused smirk. Without a word, Edric activated the direct link to the servitor positioned inside the dead hull of one of the ancient lander shuttles aboard the Langfarawida. The shuttle itself was nothing but a husk, devoid of power, its thrusters long dead. But Edric and Huffoxtan had spent the last half hour securing the Navicula Imperatoria's spare air tanks to its hull. It didn't need to be precise. It didn't need to be maneuverable. It just needed forward motion. That, even a half-lobed servitor in a void suit could manage. Edric exhaled and activated the sequence. From the landing bay, the ancient lander shuddered forward, propelled not by engines but by controlled bursts of vented gas. A cloud of dust and frozen mist swirled around the derelict vessel as it drifted toward the bay doors, inching closer, closer. Osbjorn and Edric exchanged a final nod. "If this doesn't work, I'm docking your pay," Edric muttered. Osbjorn smirked. "If it does work, you owe me a promotion." From his Auspex chair, Sigabild let out a dry chuckle despite the pain in his side. "If this works, I'll recommend to Tiberius that he makes you a captain." Grimacing, he reached for the Auspex lever with his undamaged hand and depressed it. Every sensor system on the shuttle activated at once. The Navicula Imperatoria erupted with a cacophony of jamming signals, false readings, gravimetric pulses, and data bursts, flooding every waveband with static. And a popular drinking song from NihtWyrtha, one about a drunken Mechanicus adept who mistakenly enlisted in the novice Walmer Wigathan. Edric smirked. Then he triggered the final charge. A sudden explosion ripped through the air tanks affixed to the lander's hull, sending it hurtling forward like a wrecked torpedo. It burst through the docking bay doors, tumbling into the void. The Eldari Vampire Raider's pilot barely had time to react. As the enormous transport shuttle shot from the bay, his display erupted with warnings, blinding sensor feedback, and screeching alarms. Grimacing, he yanked his helm free of his Vox link as a terrible alien wailing sound flooded his cockpit. Through the dust and crystalline ice particles, he caught sight of the ancient lander, powering away at full speed. "Monkey fools," he sneered, and flicked the firing runes. Twin lances of emerald energy crackled from his ship's four-mounted pulsar cannons, barely missing the hull of the lander. The second volley found its mark. The first shot seared through one of the lander's wings, causing it to spin violently. The second blast punched clean through its fuselage, splitting it from stern to prow. The Eldari pilot laughed, watching the shuttle disintegrate into scrap metal. A clean kill. As the Vampire Raider focused on its kill, the Navicula Imperatoria glided silently from the docking bay, emerging from beneath the Eldari vessel. Hafakstan, seated inside the ball turret, narrowed his eyes, locking onto the Raider's underbelly. Though still cloaked, its camellia-line field shimmered slightly under the falling dust and ice, revealing its hexagonal plating. Hafakstan smiled and pulled the trigger. 4 heavy bolters thundered in the void. Though silent in the vacuum, the fury of bolter rounds tore into the underbelly of the Eldari ship. The Vampire Raider's cloak faltered. Its hexagonal plating shimmered, fractured, then collapsed entirely. Rounds scored deep into the hull, overwhelming its heat sinks, causing the plating to glow red-hot under the relentless barrage. Then, an explosion erupted from its left engine. Inside the Vampire Raider, the pilot at first assumed the alarms were from a sensor overload, but when the ship shuddered violently, he knew he was under attack. He twisted the controls. The Raider began to roll, but then came the second explosion, a rupture in the plasma tanks. His eyes widened as pressure alarms blared. Countermeasures deployed, but his targeting systems were failing. And then he heard it, a lock-on warning. Impossible. His mind raced. How? A lock-on should have been impossible against Eldari stealth technology. Drukari raid, he tried to call over the Vox, but the transmission never finished. Osbjorn saw the Raider begin to roll, its pitch sending it into an uncontrolled tumble. His targeting reticule flashed red. Target acquired. He didn't hesitate. "Figward!" he shouted, and fired. Twin rocket pods streaked forward, slamming into the Raider's weapon banks, shattering the hull, while the forward autocannon rounds smashed against its armor. The Raider's cockpit came into Hafokstan's view. For a brief moment, the Eldari pilot and the Voidsman locked eyes. Hafokstan grinned and emptied his last 80 rounds into the glass. The cockpit exploded. The Vampire Raider, now a dead, spiraling hulk, collided with the wreckage of the ancient lander, and in a final cataclysmic burst, both ships were consumed in a brilliant, silent plasma firestorm. Hafokstan slumped against the cooling barrels of his empty bolters, breathing heavily as he watched the twisted wreckage drift into the void. "Gotcha," he muttered. Aboard the Langfarawita midsection, cryo chamber, Ranger Captain Elandros pushed himself up, breathing shallowly in the thin, rarefied air. His body felt weak, his vision still blurred, only just beginning to clear. A ranger knelt over him, administering Medicae, replacing his damaged breather feed. Another scout stood guard nearby, his rifle raised, scanning the shadows, and then Elandros realized he had lost 3 of his warriors. The sting of failure washed over him, and he gritted his blood-stained teeth in bitter anger. He activated his comms channel, his voice sharp with frustration. "Wraithstalker, come in and pick us up!" No reply. He repeated the order, only to hear Lirashir's voice, smooth and mocking. "Your chariot is no more," the Shadowseer intoned, his words tinged with cruel amusement. "The void is bereft of their souls, and a greedy god is sated." Elandros staggered upright, gripping the edge of a cryopod to steady himself. His maglock boots were drained of power, leaving him drifting slightly in the weightless silence of the derelict. Across from him, Lirashir knelt, watching one of the dying Monkey Voidsmen with eerie stillness. As Elandros approached, the Harlequin extended his hand. 3 spirit stones nestled in his palm, glowing with a soft spectral blue. A success, even in failure. Alandros exhaled slowly, his rage cooling into something more distant, more controlled. Despite everything, Lirashir had done what he had failed to do, saved the souls of his fallen kin. "Thank you," he muttered, forcing the words past the bitterness in his throat. Lirashir had performed a sacred duty, one that Alandros, as their leader, should have ensured himself. The debt would not be forgotten. Then, his gaze fell to the dying voidsman, sprawled on the deck with blood bubbling from a shattered faceplate. The human's breaths were shallow, rasping, each one a struggle against the inevitable. Even an Eldari would not have survived such wounds for long. Alandros looked to Lirashir's belt, where a slim monofilament blade hung. He had lost his own sword, his shuriken pistol was empty, but he still had authority. "Kill it!" he ordered. The Harlequin did not move. He simply stared into the Monkey's ruined face, his mask unreadable. "Kayla Menshakain would not approve," Lirashir murmured. Alandros frowned. The invocation of Kain, his own patron god, was unexpected. Had it been mockery? A lesson? It was difficult to tell with the Harlequins. Their words were riddles, their meanings layered. He clenched his jaw and tried again. "Fine, it's an animal." He smiled coldly. "End its suffering." Lirashir lifted 2 fingers and slowly traced a line across the voidsman's chest. To Elandros' surprise, the Monkey relaxed. The pain left his eyes. His ragged breathing slowed. With his final strength, the dying warrior nodded, as if in silent understanding. Then, he exhaled one last time and lay still. "What does that mean?" Elandros asked, narrowing his eyes at the gesture. Lirashir tilted his head, watching the cooling corpse. "They are like us in many ways," the Harlequin said softly. "He died with his wounds to the front, just as you and I would." He ran 2 fingers down his own chest in example, his masked face turned toward the captain. "Even you understand that." Elandros scoffed, shaking his head as he pressed a med patch to his bleeding cheek. "A raft can float on the ocean," he muttered, "but that does not make it a ship." Lirashir gave a slight nod, the gesture unreadable. "Not all who carry weapons are warriors." Then, with delicate reverence, he produced a dark blue spirit stone and released it. It drifted weightless in the void, hanging before the fallen voidsman's chest. Elandros let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You mock his death?" Lirashir raised a single finger, silently bidding him to wait. Elandros was about to reply when the stone began to glow. His breath caught, his stomach turned to ice. The Monkey's essence had filled the stone. Impossible. How? The world lurched beneath his feet. And then he realized it wasn't just his mind reeling. A sudden flash of white-hot light tore through the far end of the chamber. Macro cannon fire. Then another. Then another. Lances of searing energy slammed into the hull, ripping through ancient corridors like a firestorm. Alandros barely had time to shout an order before Lirashir leapt to his feet. In a flawless spinning motion, the Harlequin danced through the chaos. Between Alandros and his 2 remaining scouts, who had instinctively raised their hands to shield themselves from the incoming blasts. And then Alandros felt it. The air crackled. A whisper of unseen hands curled around his limbs, prickling against his skin. The unmistakable sensation of a teleportation beam. The last thing he saw before the world vanished was the Langfarawida exploding like a dying star. The fate of the Langfarawida. Magos ductora cogitatis, Tiberius loomed over the hololithic display, his augmented fingers drumming a rhythmic pattern against the cogitator console. The eerie green glow of the projection cast shifting light across his bronze mask, concealing the emotions that Beornwulf suspected still lurked beneath the ancient metal. Before him, Beornwulf, Heorwulf, and the techno-archaeologist stood at parade rest, the weight of their request hanging in the cold air of the command deck. "The Langfarawida is a relic beyond price," Tiberius intoned, his voice crackling with the static of his ancient vox emitters. "Its machine spirit, though long dormant, may still contain wisdom lost to Mars. You request its destruction?" Heorwulf looked to the techno-archaeologist, who gave the shortest nod. "The Langfarawida must be destroyed at once." Beornwulf cast a glance at Heorwulf, whose face remained unreadable, the dim light shadowing his features. The techno-archaeologist, usually animated when speaking of his discoveries, stood silent, gaze fixed downward. He took a deep breath. What the warp did it matter anyway? "Aye, it is swarming with Xenos," Beornwulf said, meeting the Mago's gaze with an honest face. Techno-archaeologist cleared his throat. The Eldari have stripped it bare. What little might have been left for salvage is gone. He hesitated, then added, and they will not allow us to take it. Tiberius was still. The only movement was the shifting apertures of his ocular implants, their lenses whirring as they focused on each of them in turn. Eldari presence alone does not warrant such an extreme measure, he stated, though his tone betrayed the first hints of hesitation. Beornwulf, ever the prince, took a measured step forward, his words smooth but laden with purpose. This relic is tainted, Magos. It is compromised, its secrets stolen by Xenos' hands. If the Eldari wish to keep it, let them be buried with it. Tiberius exhaled a long mechanical hiss, the vents along his spine releasing a puff of superheated air. This is not a decision I make lightly, he admitted, but the hololithic display flickered, and a new presence filled the chamber. Archmagos Damia Voratrix. Her features were indistinct, blurred by the distortion of her archaic projection unit, but her voice was as sharp as the cutting edge of a newly forged blade. The ship is to be destroyed, she stated. No pleasantries, no hesitation. Tiberius stiffened, his servo arms twitching involuntarily. Archmagos, this is non-negotiable, she cut him off. You were sent to reclaim knowledge, not to invite catastrophe. Any threat to my forge is unacceptable. I will not have an Eldari fleet within a light year of my forge world. Silence. The weight of her words settled heavily in the chamber. Tiberius lowered his head, his cogitators processing the inevitable conclusion. As you command, he said, resignation thick in his tone. The Langfarawita will be reduced to cinders. Engine kill, with all alacrity. The transmission cut off, leaving nothing but the dim flickering of lumen strips overhead. Beornwulf exhaled, though he was uncertain why. The Magos turned away from them, issuing quiet orders to his Skitarii and naval officers. The Quester Revelation hung in the void, its massive broadside batteries locked onto the drifting, ancient form of the Langfarawita. The colony ship lay still in the blackness, its skeletal frame silent, its once proud hull pockmarked by time and the battle that had played out upon its decks. The first salvo struck like a god's wrath. Lances of searing energy lanced through the ship's midsection, gutting its superstructure in a cascade of molten metal and venting atmosphere. The void swallowed the ship's death throes without sound, but within, the fury of destruction was deafening. Explosions rippled along its spine as fire tore through cryochambers that had cradled the long-dead ancestors of NihtWyrtha. Hallways that had known only silence for millennia were consumed in moments, their walls blasted apart, scattering dust and long-lost memories into the abyss. Macro-cannon shells slammed into the ship's stern, splitting bulkheads as plasma reactors ruptured, unleashing the last vestiges of the vessel's forgotten power. The Langfarawita shuddered, its ancient form cracking as shockwaves rippled through its length. Great plates of armor peeled away, tumbling end over end, ghostly remnants of a dream that had survived 20,000 years, only to die in fire and ruin. As the final barrage struck home, the ship broke apart completely, its shattered core dispersing into the void like dying embers scattered to the solar wind. Where once had floated a relic of a lost age, now only debris remained, twisted metal, drifting bones, and echoes of what might have been. For a moment the void seemed to mourn, then silence reclaimed it, and the Langfarawita was no more. Without another word, Beornwulf, Beornwulf, and the techno-archaeologist left the chamber. Beornwulf leaned against the cold metal of the corridor wall, arms crossed over his chest. He watched Beornwulf and the techno-archaeologist ahead of him, the latter fussing over the collection of data slates and holotomes he had gathered. Then, finally, the words slipped free. Why? Beornwulf turned, one brow raised in question. Why did I just help destroy the greatest find of our homeworld? Beornwulf repeated. I don't even know what was on that ship that scared you both so much, but I backed you anyway. He let out a short, mirthless laugh. Instinct, I suppose. Or maybe I've been a warrior too long. The techno-archaeologist looked at Beornwulf, then hesitated before stepping forward. Slowly, reverently, he pulled something from beneath his cloak. Beornwulf's breath caught. It was a parchment, made with some form of plastic cover, but its weight, its meaning. He stared for a long moment. Then he nodded. I, he said simply, That is a reason to blast a priceless relic into oblivion, he stated dryly, his spine shivering with implication. He felt breathless, nothing to do with his bandaged ribs. He took his hanging warrior ring from his neck, looking at it, lost in thought. He let out a slow breath, pushing himself away from the wall, his voice turning lighter as he shook off the weight of what they had done. My service term is nearly up, you know. I was Hlaford of Silthdale before this. I've done my fighting. Once I finish my last months on system patrol, I'm retiring to run my hold. Hjorwolf chuckled, his usual mirth returning. You will be missed. The Navis Astra Wigathane will be a lot smaller without you. They clasped forearms in friendship, warriors bound by blood, duty, and now, secrets. Behind them, the techno-archaeologist barely heard, lost in the sea of information he had saved. His fingers skimmed the surface of a data slate, eyes alight with wonder. Then, almost absently, he murmured, "There are 2 more colony ships out there, and they'll be arriving in the not-too-distant future." The words hung in the air. The past was not yet finished with them. Bjornwolf made a tight face. "Maybe I will do the patrol run for a while, just in case," he said. Aboard Eldari warship. Echo of Endeavor, Farseer Yinane stood motionless at the viewing port, watching as another star was born in fire and silence. The Langfarawita was gone. At this distance, its death was nothing more than a brief, flickering ember swallowed by the abyss. The vast dust field around her vessel drifted on, indifferent to the destruction that had played out in its midst. Behind her, the air shimmered with the hush of footfalls, whisper light, as if reality itself hesitated at their presence. She did not turn. She did not need to. Shadowseer Larashir had arrived. The Harlequin's movements were poetry without voice, a ballet of deliberate stillness woven between each step. He drifted like a specter to her side, bowing with exaggerated flourish, one hand sweeping wide, the other pressed to his heart as though playing out an invisible tragedy. Beside him, Ranger Captain Elandros moved with all the stiffness of one still nursing fresh wounds, his armor scorched, his face a patchwork of dried blood and synth skin. His sharp eyes scanned the void beyond, but his silence was expectant. "What happened?" Elandros finally asked, wincing at the pain in his cheek. Yinane exhaled through her nose. "The Drukhari." She did not mask the venom in her voice. "They destroyed the Monkai relic. The pilot of the vampire managed to get off a warning before he fell. No doubt they fed well on whatever wretches they could claim before the fire consumed them. Another reason I should throttle that Eilith when next we cross paths." Elandros grunted, removing the spirit stones from his belt. He placed them on the ledge before her, 3 bright, pulsing gems. The dead, as promised. Yinane's fingers ghosted over the stones, feeling their heat, their presence, their whispers. Each one a life saved from the endless hunger of she who thirsts. She would return them to Anaris Elthir, where they would join the infinity circuits of their ancestors. A rustle of movement, a breath of shifting silk. Lirashir had not spoken. He had only watched. But now, with a slow and deliberate gesture, he stepped forward and unfolded his gloved hand. A 4th stone, cradled in his palm. It glowed softly, dim, uncertain. Not the searing brightness of an Eldari soul, but something paler, more muted. A shadow of a soul, a specter trapped in crystal. Yinane reached out, but the Harlequin withdrew it, twirling away as though the act of giving was not yet complete. He mimed a blade across his throat, then touched the stone to his own breastplate as if it had pierced his heart. Only then did he let it drift into her open palm. It was not Eldari, but it was a soul, all the same. Her mind stretched outward, the gift of foresight unfurling like smoke. She peered into the stone, past its glow, past its dim and flickering life. A shadow. No whispering soul, but a presence. A remnant of something unfinished, something waiting. Her thoughts recoiled, not in fear but in revelation. NihtWyrtha. She had seen them, the seers of that world, their fates twisted, blurred, as though straddling the boundary between what was and what could have been. She had often pondered what they were, what they could have been, had fate been kinder to their species. And now she knew. They were Proto-Eldari. Elandros' voice was sharp. "I can burn NihtWyrtha, bring the fleet, reduce it to ash." His anger was a storm barely contained behind his rigid composure. He had lost warriors on that wreck. He had seen what the Monkei were, what they could become. He would not suffer the risk. Lirashir moved, a flourish of motion, effortless and precise, flowing between moments of perfect stillness. The Harlequin extended an invisible blade to Elandros's chest, holding it there. He did not speak. He did not need to. A jest, a warning, a lesson. Then, as if drawing a veil from the air, the Shadow Seer produced another stone, dark, cracked, lifeless, Drukhari. He let it drop, but before it hit the ground, it was no longer a spirit stone at all. A wag's skull tumbled into existence, the same as before, taken from a Navis Astra Wigathane throne. The beast's fanged maw grinned up at them, its hollow sockets staring, knowing. Elandros scowled. His hand drifted to his belt, to where his blade should have been, but his fingers only clenched the empty space where it had once rested. Yinane considered. She turned the dull spirit stone over in her fingers, gazing out once more at the dying embers of the Langfarawita. Then she spoke. "No, let the water world be." She turned to face Elandros. "We retreat to Anaris Elthir. Let NihtWyrtha and its people play their part. Sooner or later they will face Elfscathia, and fate will decide who has the strength to survive." The Harlequin remained as the other two left the room. He stood for a long moment looking out at the burning Langfarawita. Then after an age he withdrew the bolt of silk, stained in blood. Holding it in one hand, he pilled it away. The silk fell to the flood in a gentle flutter. In the palm of his hand he held a silver wolf's head. This one snarling with open maw, teeth bared. He gave a gentle sigh. This was how it must be, he knew. But even for one of his kind, the knowledge was bitter. A play with many parts, many actors. The jester was to become a king. He ran 2 fingers across his chest, then fell to the deck, arms outstretched in a silent mimic of a scream. He missed the slight tingle, as a very small cogwheel fell onto the floor beside him. Fiskbala Station. In the dimly lit sanctum of her private chamber, Archmagus Damia Voratrix sat cross-legged upon a raised dais, draped in the deep folds of her ceremonial robes. Shadows flickered over the polished obsidian of her domain, casting an eerie glow from the faint lumen strips embedded in the sanctum's vaulted ceiling. The air was thick with incense, a cloying mixture of sacred oils and machine worship, masking the cold sterility of the Mechanicus constructs that surrounded her. Before her, a hololithic projection shimmered in the darkness. It was the captured feed from the techno-archaeologist's servo-cherubs, ghostly and grainy, yet clear enough to reveal the image that had seized her attention. The secret, the great revelation buried beneath centuries of dust and forgotten time. The very thing that had been hidden from Tiberius, from the Imperium, from those whose lack of vision rendered them unworthy of its knowledge. Her slender fingers, adorned with fine strands of gold-threaded augmetics, tapped idly upon the armrest of her throne. Pyrovox had always said she was adept at improvisation, and she knew the old fool was right. This was unexpected, yes, but opportunity often came in the guise of the unforeseen. If nurtured correctly, this knowledge could be woven seamlessly into her grand designs, an unseen thread in the great tapestry she was crafting. The edges of her lips curled into a knowing smile, a subtle expression of amusement and satisfaction. Information was power, and this was power beyond reckoning. With a flick of her wrist, the hololithic image blinked out, the truth vanishing into the void. Her expression did not falter as she issued a final command. The servitors in the chamber, their soulless eyes flickering with machine light, stood motionless as the purge command ran through their cranial implants. Their minds, such as they were, went blank, scrubbed clean of the last few minutes, their memory slates rewritten as if the revelation had never existed. She rose gracefully, her robes shifting like liquid shadow. The universe was shifting, and she would be the hand that guided its course. For the first time in decades, Archmagus Damia Voratrix allowed herself a moment of genuine anticipation.